A child was born in a world where names meant nothing and silence was survival. His name was Thagis, but it was not spoken with love, not even once. He was born in a fortified district deep within the Outer Rim territories claimed by the Sith Empire, a world choked by lightning storms and draped in black metal. No stars shone through the sky, no laughter escaped the halls. Only the rhythm of training sabers and the soft hum of surveillance droids filled the air. His earliest memories were not of toys or warmth, but of boots on stone, of cold food, and of being watched. He never met his father. His mother, if she could be called that, never touched him. She worked in the genetic foundries. Thagis was raised in a communal dormitory with 20 others' potential assets, evaluated and sorted. In the Empire, childhood was not a protected stage. It was a test. Every meal, every motion, every emotion was a metric. Those who wept vanished. Those who hesitated were punished. And those who resisted were never mentioned again. Thagis learned quickly. Not because he was clever, but because he was afraid. He watched one boy, a year older than him, whisper back to a trainer. The next day, the boy returned with a limp and didn't speak again. Another was caught stealing food. The others were forced to watch as he was beaten unconscious and dragged away. So Thagis obeyed. Every command, every rule. He made no sound unless spoken to. He flinched before strikes landed, and he never asked questions. This was the first lesson the Empire taught him, that life was not his own. It belonged to those stronger than him. But fear was not all he learned. At night, when the lights dimmed and the dormitory fell silent, he stared at the ceiling and counted his breaths. He remembered the faces of those who had been taken. The trainers said they were weak, that they deserved it. But in his heart, Thagis wondered, what if they were just unlucky? What if the system didn't care about strength, only control? No one ever said it aloud, but all the children knew. The Empire wasn't raising leaders. It was building weapons. Thagis didn't dream of power. He didn't imagine himself on the Dark Council or wielding a crimson blade. He only wanted to survive, to not be chosen for pain. But deep inside, a question began to grow slowly, like a spark buried in ash. Why did it have to be like this? Why was obedience the price of life? The trainers saw something in him. Not talent, not brilliance, but stillness, discipline, predictability. They mistook his silence for loyalty, and so he was passed to the next level. At age 6, he was assigned a number, not a rank, not a title, just a number. It was sewn into his uniform and etched into his identity chip. From that day forward, no one used his name, and when he spoke it aloud, no one listened. The galaxy moved on. Wars raged far beyond his walls, but in that compound, time stood still. Days bled into nights, pain followed obedience, and the only reward was another breath. Yet somewhere beneath the surface, Thagis was changing. He stopped feeling afraid. Not because he was brave, but because he was empty. The fear had rotted into something else, something colder, something heavier. He didn't want freedom. He didn't want vengeance. He didn't even want peace. He wanted someone to notice. Not the trainers, not the guards, someone. But no one came. And so, as the years passed, the spark turned to stone. His tears dried, his voice faded, and Thagis became exactly what they wanted. A boy without hope, a servant without a soul, a future Sith, trained not to lead but to obey. The ship that carried him away had no windows. Thagis was 11 when they took him. One morning, without warning, his number was called. No goodbye. no destination. He was handed a black uniform, 2 nutrient bars, and placed in the back of a transport with 5 other boys. None of them spoke. They traveled for hours, or maybe days. Time blurred inside the sealed hull. The silence became heavier than the darkness. And then, they arrived. Dromund cars. The heart of the Empire. The air was thicker here, charged with storms and ancient rage. The sky above churned endlessly, never letting in the stars. The buildings reached like jagged teeth toward the clouds, and the ground was soaked with the weight of history. But it wasn't the storms or the towers that unsettled Thejas. It was the eyes. They were everywhere. Red lenses hidden behind glass, guards with emotionless masks, droids that never blinked. Every hallway, every dorm, every training pit. Someone was always watching. And even when alone, Thejas felt observed, as if the planet itself was sentient, waiting to see him fail. The academy had no welcome, no initiation, only more orders, more silence, and more eyes. He was now part of a larger system. Older acolytes walked with bruised faces and sharpened glares. Instructors carried whips and sabers. Droids floated through the halls, recording everything. And posted on the walls were the words, "There is no strength without pain. There is no loyalty without fear." His training began at dawn and ended at exhaustion. He was taught to fight with shock blades, to block with his mind, to read the movements of enemies before they struck. But the worst lessons came when the training ended, when they were pitted against each other. Not in games, in trials. 1 week they were starved, another locked in darkness with no sound, then forced to fight their closest peer, blindfolded, while instructors whispered lies in their ears. Every day was a new test, not of skill but of control. Thejas passed them all, not because he was the strongest, he wasn't. Others moved faster, struck harder, used the Force more naturally. But they broke, cracked under the pressure, made mistakes. He didn't. Because by then, Thejas no longer cared what happened to him. He had no desire, no fear, no fire. His emptiness was his strength. The instructors began to notice, and so did the others. One of them, an acolyte named Kryn, began trailing him, watching his movements, measuring his silence. One night, Kryn approached him in the dorm and whispered, "You're hiding something. You're more than you pretend to be." Thejas didn't respond. He couldn't tell if it was a threat or an invitation. But it didn't matter. The next day, Kryn was gone. Some said he failed a mission. Others claimed he was executed for disobedience. Thejas didn't believe either. He began to understand. Here, suspicion was deadly. Visibility was dangerous. The safest path was to remain invisible, to be useful, but not remarkable, to obey every command without speaking too loudly, and to survive each trial without standing too tall. It worked. By the age of 14, Thejas had survived what hundreds hadn't, and yet he still had no friends, no titles, no masters. He remained a quiet shadow in a place that fed on ambition, and that was when the rumors started. Whispers that the Dark Council had eyes in the academy, that they were watching for the next apprentice, that a name, a real name, could be given if the right acolyte showed the right hunger. But Thejas didn't want a name. He wanted something else, something even darker. Pain became a language he understood. By 15, Thejas no longer reacted to it. He did not flinch at shock buttons. He did not scream when his bones broke. He healed in silence. And the instructors, always watching, always measuring, took note. But what they failed to see was that Thejas wasn't enduring pain. He was learning from it. Each punishment taught him something more, about limits, about power, about the way fear shaped obedience not just in others, but in himself. The more they beat him, the more he understood how to wield that same control. It wasn't strength that ruled others. It was consequence. At the academy, punishment was constant. There was no warning, no reason. One day, the lights would flicker, and students would be dragged from their meals for questioning. Another day, an entire group would be forced to kneel in the rain while lightning danced overhead. The instructors never explained their methods. They didn't need to. Fear did the explaining for them. They just watched the others crumble under the weight. Not always physically but mentally. One acolyte, Seric, had been outspoken, proud, confident. He lasted 6 months. After his first failure in a live blade sparring test, the instructors sent him to a week of isolation. When he returned, he was quiet, then silent, then gone. And yet, Thejas never stood out. He didn't win every match. He didn't raise his hand in lessons. But he made no enemies. He followed orders. And when pain came, because it always came, he accepted it like gravity, unmoving, unquestioning, until one day it changed. It was a trial more brutal than the others, a test of loyalty framed as obedience. They were told to kneel for 4 hours beneath a thunderstorm. No movement, no sound. If they failed, they would be expelled. And on Dromund cars, expelled meant disappeared. The rain came like needles. 1 hour passed, then 2, then 3. Around him, bodies trembled. Some collapsed. But Thejas didn't move. Not because he was strong, but because he refused to feel. Pain was not punishment. It was permission. At the 4th hour, an instructor walked behind them. She stopped beside Thejas. Quietly, without warning, she drew a thin blade and pressed it against his shoulder. She sliced downward, not deep but slow. He didn't flinch. He didn't even breathe. Later, they would say he was rewarded for his resilience, that his loyalty had been proven. But Thejas knew the truth. That moment wasn't a test. It was a message. You will be broken, but not yet. After the trial, he was called into a private chamber, alone. No instructors, just one Sith Lord. Cloaked in black, face hidden, voice like rusted metal. The Lord asked him nothing. Instead, he raised his hand and sent a wave of lightning straight into Thejas's chest. The pain was different, cleaner, sharper. It bypassed the nerves and struck something deeper, something in the soul. Thejas collapsed. But when he opened his eyes, the Sith was still there, still watching. He extended his hand. Thejas took it. No words were spoken, no rank given, no apprenticeship offered. But something changed that day. The other acolytes noticed the way instructors began to look at him. The way guards stepped aside just a little quicker. He had not been chosen. He had been marked. From then on, the punishments stopped. But the trials became more precise, more personal. Designed not to break him but to shape him. He wasn't being tested anymore. He was being prepared. The first time he heard his name again, it was spoken by someone who wanted him dead. He was 17, taller now, quieter than ever. His eyes had grown darker, not in color but in weight. When he walked through the academy, others stepped aside. Not because he was feared, but because he had become something worse. Predictable, detached, unreachable. He had survived every trial, every punishment. But survival had cost him something. His voice no longer carried meaning. His movements were sharp, but empty. He had no friends, no rivals, only silence. Until the duel. It wasn't sanctioned. The instructors encouraged conflict. But this was personal. The other acolyte was older, stronger, and bitter. He had trained for years, convinced he would become an apprentice. But when Tagus began rising in quiet favor, the instructor's attention shifted. It didn't matter that Tagus never spoke, or that he never sought power. In the Empire, presence alone was threat. The ambush came during a storm. The two met in the southern corridor away from the cameras. It started with a shove, then a blade. No warning, no rules. And in that moment, something ancient woke inside Tagus. He didn't fight to win. He fought to end. The other boy moved fast, but Tagus didn't dodge. He stepped into the strike, took the pain, let it open the door inside him. The years of silence, the nights in the rain, the cuts, the lashes, the lightning, they didn't make him strong. They made him angry, and when he struck back, it wasn't with skill. It was with certainty. A single blow, straight to the throat, followed by another, and another, until the corridor went quiet again. When the body fell, Tagus looked down. He felt nothing. Not victory, not regret, just recognition. Something inside him whispered, "This is what they wanted you to become." That night, he was summoned. No instructors, no acolytes, only a single shuttle waiting in the courtyard. No destination was given, but he understood. He had been noticed. The flight was silent. Hours passed, the storm faded behind him. And then, at last, the ship descended not onto a battlefield, not into another academy, but into a dark fortress carved into the rocks of a dead world. There, within a vaulted chamber, waited a council of masked figures, lords cloaked in shadows, their names unknown, their faces hidden. But one of them spoke. His voice was cold, measured. "You have no legacy, no master, no bloodline. You were not chosen." The voice paused. "And yet you live." The chamber fell silent. Then the voice continued. "Names are power, and yours has none. So we give you ours." The robed figure raised a hand, and with it, a holocron floated forward. It was small, angular. Red light pulsed at its core. "This is your burden," the voice said, "and your proof." The holocron opened. Inside was nothing but a name. Vengean. Tagus said nothing. The weight of the word filled the chamber like a wound reopened. It was not a name of glory. It was not ancient. It did not echo with prophecy or bloodline. It was a weapon, forged from pain, sharpened by survival, given only to those who had endured not to lead, but to punish. When Tagus left the chamber, he did not feel elevated. He felt buried. He had not become a Sith Lord. He had become a message. The academy did not teach. It erased. It was not a place of learning. It was a forge, and its fire was humiliation. Tagus arrived without fanfare. No banners, no greetings. Just a shove through the metal gate and the snap of a command word. The guards didn't even glance at him. To them, he was nothing. Another number in the stream of bodies fed to the ancient machine. But the academy knew what to do with nothing. It carved. Dromund-Kaas was already a world heavy with darkness. The skies filled with storms that never passed. The ground split by centuries of ancient wars. But the academy was something older than even the lightning. Its halls were black stone, cold to the touch, marked by scars older than memory. It breathed cruelty, not as punishment but as purpose. The first week, he was not tested in combat. He was tested in silence. They were fed lies, pitted against one another, told that weakness came from mercy, that to survive, they had to destroy what little remained of kindness inside them. Instructors beat them not to provoke rebellion but to see who would stop flinching. Droids recorded every reaction, not just strength but hesitation. They wanted to see who could become less than human fastest. Thagis did not excel. He did not win duels. He was not clever, not agile. His force sensitivity was muted, functional, but unremarkable. He was, at best, forgettable. And that was his strength. While others screamed, he was quiet. When peers lashed out in fear or anger, Thagis absorbed the pain without answer. He took the bruises, the insults, the isolation, and let them burn a deeper hole in him. Something he never named. Something that watched. The others started calling him the Hollow. Not to his face, never to his face. But behind closed doors, when the lights dimmed and fear loosened their tongues. They didn't know how right they were. Thagis did not hate them. He barely noticed them. His focus was singular, survive. That meant obedience. That meant silence. That meant giving the instructors no reason to remove him. The academy fed on weakness. Yes, but it also feared unpredictability. And Thagis was nothing if not steady. But even in silence, the scars formed. There was a boy named Legrin, louder, stronger, older. The kind of acolyte who thought fear was control. He chose Thagis as a target, threw him to the floor, mocked his stillness, waited for a reaction. He never got one. Not until the third time. That night, Thagis waited until the dorms emptied, found Legrin washing blood from his hands, and without a word, broke his nose against the basin wall. No warning, no anger, just one strike. Fast, direct, final. Legrin never looked at him again. Neither did anyone else. The instructors noticed. They didn't punish Thagis. They didn't praise him either. They simply gave him harder trials. Left him alone longer. Removed supervision when he trained. They were watching him differently. Now, not as a student, but as a project. He hadn't passed any exams. But he had proven something else. That he didn't need approval. That he didn't crave validation. That he didn't even care if he lived or died. And to the Sith, that made him valuable. Not because he had ambition, but because he didn't. Every wall in the academy had been built by the broken. The stone was ancient, dragged from worlds long conquered, reforged under Sith hands and soaked in the blood of those who failed. Some said the walls whispered during the night. Others said they remembered. But Thagis didn't listen to legends. He only listened to what the stones taught him. They were cold, unmoving, unfeeling. And they endured. That's what he became. The physical training intensified. What once had been simple trials became campaigns of suffering. Each day brought new torments. Forced marches through lightning storms. Fasting rituals followed by hand-to-hand combat. Lessons interrupted by surprise interrogations where questions had no right answers, and silence was just another failure. The academy didn't want warriors. It wanted survivors who could kill without hesitation and kneel without pride. Thagis adapted. He stopped asking why. He stopped noticing how often his body bled. Muscle replaced hesitation. Scar tissue mapped his arms. He trained until his joints locked, and when they did, he forced them to move anyway. The others still whispered, but now they whispered less. They were beginning to understand. There was a mission in his stillness. Some thought he was hiding rage. Others believed he was mindless. But they were both wrong. There was no emotion left to show. No wound left to hide. There was only the next day. and the day after that. 1 month, the instructors introduced a new kind of test, a forge trial. No lightsabers, no force, just heat, metal, endurance. Each acolyte was ordered to carry a bar of untempered durasteel across a courtyard under cast lightning for a full hour. The metal would sear, the burns would scar. Any drop, any hesitation, immediate disqualification. 6 acolytes participated. Only 2 completed it. Thegus was one of them. The skin on his palms peeled away. His fingers melted into the bar. When the trial ended, the instructors had to cut it from his grip. He didn't scream. He didn't even blink. In the medical ward, the droid paused when it examined him. Pain levels were supposed to trigger neural responses, but Thegus's reading stayed flat. No spikes, no distress. He wasn't resisting pain anymore. He had become something that didn't recognize it. Instructors debated him behind closed doors. Files were flagged, reports sent upward. There were no claims of force mastery, no tactical genius, but something about his consistency disturbed them. He didn't disobey. He didn't speak out of turn, but he didn't bow either. When Darth Drellick, a visiting Sith Lord known for personally inspecting potential apprentices, came through the academy, most students trembled at his presence. His crimson robes, his disfigured mask, his trail of acolyte corpses. But when he passed by Thegus during a sparring demonstration, the boy didn't look away. He held the Sith Lord's gaze for exactly 3 seconds. No defiance, no challenge, just recognition. Drellick paused, looked back, then kept walking. He said nothing. But from that day forward, the instructors changed Thegus's routine. Longer hours, harsher trials, more isolation. They were pushing something, not to test his strength, but to see if he would break. He didn't. And as the months bled into years, the line between punishment and training disappeared. The academy was no longer a place to become Sith. It was a place where the Force watched to see who would crawl out alive. And for Thegus, the crawling had ended long ago. He was no longer being shaped by pain. He was made of it. The first time Thegus sensed he was being studied, it was not by an instructor or a droid. It was by someone who moved without sound. Someone whose presence dimmed the room, the way a shadow darkens a fire before it goes out. A masked Sith Lord had arrived at the academy, not to teach, not to test, but to watch. His name was Darth Urkon, a figure the acolytes whispered about but never approached. His mask was carved obsidian, smooth on one side, fractured on the other, as if his face had been split in 2. No one knew what he looked like beneath it. No one asked. His reputation was enough. They said he had once executed an entire training wing to see if fear improved discipline. When he entered a room, hearts stopped. But Thegus wasn't afraid. He wasn't brave either. He was simply empty. And that emptiness drew Urkon's gaze the way gravity draws falling stones. Their first meeting was in a combat hall. Acolytes were sparring with shock blades, their bodies shaking under repeated hits. Thegus held his ground against an opponent much stronger than him. The blades sparked, the air crackled, but his face remained blank. Urkon stepped closer. He said nothing, didn't gesture, didn't interfere. He simply watched Thegus in silence, observing the way he absorbed impact after impact without changing expression. The instructors noticed. The other acolytes noticed. Even the droids shifted their recording angles toward him. But Thegus did not look back. Not then. Later that night, in the corridor lit by flickering red lamps, he felt the same presence return. Cold, heavy, focused. He turned, expecting an instructor. Instead, Erkan stood alone in the hall. No guards, no escort, just the mask. The Sith Lord approached slowly, as if testing the weight of every step. His robes whispered across the floor. He stopped a few paces from Thagis and tilted his head, as though examining a strange artifact. "Your fear is silent," Erkan murmured. His voice was calm, almost quiet, yet it carried through the hallway like a blade sliding from a sheath. "But it is still there." Thagis did not respond. Erkan circled him once, each step deliberate. Fear that is hidden rots. Fear that is accepted becomes power. The Lord paused behind him. "Which one are you?" Thagis remained still. The Sith Lord leaned closer. "Do you seek strength? Or do you simply refuse to die?" Thagis finally answered. "Does it matter?" Erkan stopped moving. Most acolytes begged for attention, tried to impress, lied about ambition. Thagis offered none of that. No hunger, no desperation, only truth. A truth that unsettled the Sith Lord more than arrogance ever could. Erkan stepped in front of him again. "One day, the galaxy will either break you or fear you." His voice lowered. "The choice will not be yours. It never is." Then, with a slow gesture, Erkan placed a gloved hand on Thagis's shoulder. A pulse of dark energy surged through him. It wasn't lightning, it wasn't pain. It was weight, as if someone had placed a mountain inside his chest. Testing his core, measuring his resolve, Thagis held firm. Erkan withdrew his hand. "Good," he whispered. "You do not seek death. You simply do not fear it." He turned, cloak sweeping the floor, and walked away. Two instructors stood nearby, hidden in the shadows, watching the exchange with nervous tension. When Erkan disappeared down the hall, they exchanged a single glance. Everything had changed. From that night forward, whispers followed Thagis wherever he went. Some believed Erkan had chosen him. Others believed he had marked him for destruction. In the academy, attention from a Sith Lord could lead to power, or to a grave. But Thagis didn't crave either. He only knew one thing. Erkan had seen something behind the mask. Thagis wore the mask built from silence, pain, and endurance. And once a Sith saw you, they never stopped watching. The shift didn't happen in a single moment. It crept in, slow and unseen, like a toxin moving through blood. The instructors didn't announce it. The droids didn't record it. But one day, when Thagis entered the training hall, the others didn't look at him. They looked away. He had become something more than a peer. More than a rival, he was a warning. The instructors gave him a wider berth. They no longer barked at him for tempo or posture. They watched, measured, waited. It wasn't respect. It was caution. As if even they weren't sure where he fit anymore. One morning, a new arrival was brought in, a girl from Ziost, known for her dueling form and force control. Her name was Sayla, and she was everything Thagis wasn't. Confident, vocal, talented. She sparred with others like a dancer, smiling between strikes, fluid and graceful. And for a time, she was admired. Then she challenged Thagis. It wasn't personal. It wasn't malicious. She had simply heard of him, the quiet one, the hollow, the favorite. She wanted to test him, maybe even impress the instructors. They met in the central ring. Dozens of acolytes gathered, some eager, some silent. Sayla bowed. Thagis didn't. When the duel began, she moved quickly, blades flashing, footwork perfect. He didn't counter, he blocked, he absorbed. Blow after blow rained down on him, but he held ground. And then, without warning, he struck. One movement, a single turn. Her blade flew from her hand and clattered across the stone. Thagis stepped forward. She backed away. For the first time, her smile faded. He didn't strike again. He didn't need to. The instructors called the match. Sayla bowed again, her pride still mostly intact. But when she looked into Thargis's eyes, she saw it. He hadn't been fighting her. He had been deciding whether or not to end her. That was the moment it changed for everyone else. Thargis no longer needed to prove anything. Not to the instructors, not to the counselors, not even to himself. He had stopped growing. Not because he couldn't, but because growth required hunger. And Thargis had none, only gravity. A few weeks later, 2 acolytes were found unconscious in the barracks. No explanation, no marks, no reports, just silence. Whispers followed that they had mocked Thargis behind closed doors, that someone had overheard. The instructors didn't investigate. They didn't need to. Fear did the rest. When students passed him in the corridors, they pressed themselves against the walls. When his name came up in whispered conversations, voices dropped even lower. He was no longer the hollow. He was something worse. He was the one the Academy feared would never leave. The ones who wanted power tried to avoid him. The ones who wanted to survive tried to learn from him. But no one stood beside him. No one called him friend. There was no warmth, no allegiance, only shadows. And in those shadows, Thargis thrived. Because he had never asked to be seen. He had only asked to be left alone. And now, even that was no longer his choice. At the edge of the academy, high above the flooded jungle swamps, there was a balcony where he sometimes stood alone beneath the eternal storm, watching the clouds shift and pulse. He would stand there in silence, feeling the static charge in the air, the cold wind on his skin. No thoughts, no dreams, only the storm. It was the only thing in the galaxy that matched the way he felt inside. And soon, even the storm would look away. War did not come as a surprise. It came as a whisper. The great galactic war had been building for decades, a slow, festering fracture between 2 ancient powers. But for Thargis, war wasn't political. It wasn't even strategic. It was an opening, a doorway. The first time the galaxy would be forced to look at what the Sith Empire had created, and what it had buried. He was 19 when the call came. His final trials were skipped, his formal titles postponed. The Academy needed bodies. The Empire needed weapons. And Thargis, now known only as Vengean, was ready. He didn't say goodbye. No one did. The shuttle that took him from Dromund Kaas was filled with other acolytes. Some whispered. Some sat with eyes closed, preparing for death. Vengean sat in silence, staring at the floor as if already beneath it. When the doors opened, they were no longer students. They were soldiers. The war had erupted along dozens of fronts. Core systems, outer rim strongholds. Republic territory bled into imperial ambition. But Vengean's path wasn't chosen for him. It was designed. His first orders were simple. Observe. Eliminate. Endure. The battlefield was Corellia. Not the cities, the underworks. The tunnels below the surface where civilians fled and resistance cells grew bold. Republic spies had embedded themselves beneath the planet's skin, feeding intelligence back to Coruscant. The Empire wanted them gone. Vengean was told to start with the leaders, but he didn't. He started with the ones who watched. Scouts, engineers, messengers, anyone who held a line of sight. He killed without ceremony, without speech, without warning. Not because it was strategic, but because he wanted to see what happened when the Republic lost its eyes. The panic spread faster than the blood. The rebels turned on each other. Accusations, confusion, Officers disappeared. Supply lines collapsed. It wasn't a battle, it was a ghost story. And Vengean moved through it without a single scar. The Sith commanders noticed. Reports flowed upward. His methods were unorthodox, but effective. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't request support. He delivered silence. The Republic began pulling units back from the underworks. Not because they were defeated, but because they didn't understand what they were fighting. Some believed it was a Sith specter. Others thought it was a rogue assassin. Vengean never gave them an answer. He simply moved on. From Corellia to Balmorra. From Balmorra to Megiddo. The trail was not marked by victories, it was marked by absences. Places where resistance had once been loud, and now whispered only in fear. But with every mission, something else grew inside him. Not pride, not power. Emptiness. The more he destroyed, the more hollow he became. The battlefield didn't change him. It revealed him. The instructors on Dromund Kaas had only taught him to survive. War taught him that survival had no reward. Commanders offered him commendations. He ignored them. Units began requesting him by name. He didn't respond. He followed orders only when they aligned with his silence. And when they didn't, he acted alone. He wasn't interested in glory. He was looking for something else. He didn't know what it was, but he knew war hadn't given it to him. And still, he kept moving forward, because destruction was the only language he remembered how to speak. Balmorra was not a battlefield. It was a grave waiting to be filled. The planet had been bleeding long before Vengean arrived. Factories burned without pause. Smoke hung in the air like a shroud. The Republic and Empire fought over every street, every hill, every broken machine. Soldiers died for ground that changed hands again by nightfall. Nothing stayed steady here except the suffering. When Vengean stepped onto the soil, the war did not notice him. But he noticed the war. Balmorra felt familiar, not in its violence, but in its silence. Its factories moaned with the same low hum as the training halls of Dromund Kaas. Its shadows felt like the corners he had once hid in. Even the lightning that occasionally tore the sky reminded him of the stormy nights that shaped him as a boy. It was almost comforting. Almost. His unit was small specialists sent to crack open the Republic's fortified lines in the southern industrial district. Officers expected him to follow commands, coordinate with squads, and support the standard assault. He did none of that. Instead, he walked away from the briefing without a word and entered the factories alone. The others thought he had lost his mind, but Vengean wasn't chasing glory. He was listening not with the Force, not with instinct, but with something deeper. A sense he had sharpened long before the Academy ever gave him a weapon. He listened for fear. It echoed through the pipes and vents. Every worker, every soldier hiding in the metal labyrinth, left behind a trail of desperation. Vengean followed it like a scent. When a group of Republic engineers whispered plans into a comlink, he was already behind them. When a squad of troopers prepared an ambush, he was already watching from the rafters. He didn't strike quickly. He struck with silence. By dawn, an entire sector had collapsed. Communications dead, patrols missing, supply lines severed. None of it caused by massive battles or overwhelming Sith power. Just one man moving through steel corridors like a shadow that had learned to kill. His commanding officer demanded an explanation. Vengean didn't answer. He simply walked past him, hands still stained from the night before. The officer said nothing else. The Empire pushed forward, using the gaps Vengean carved. But what unsettled commanders most wasn't the success, it was how the Republic responded. Squads refused to enter the factories. Reinforcements requested immediate evacuation. Whispered reports of an unseen executioner spread through the trenches faster than orders could counter them. They called him the Quiet Blade. They were wrong. He wasn't a blade. He wasn't even a weapon. He was the absence of mercy shaped into a living form. His presence began to shift the morale of Imperial troops. Soldiers fought harder, not because they believed in victory, but because Vengean's existence suggested that fear itself fought on their side. Some tried speaking to him. None succeeded. He didn't react to praise, didn't answer questions, didn't acknowledge gratitude. He simply kept moving, always forward, always deeper into the war's darkest corners. One night, after clearing another sector, he paused on a catwalk overlooking a factory floor filled with fallen Republic troopers. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel hatred. But for the first time, he felt something close to understanding. The war wasn't creating him. It was revealing the shape he had always been. A shape the Empire could use. A shape the galaxy would learn to fear. Vengean turned away from the bodies and walked into the shadows. The fire below crackled like distant thunder, painting the walls red. But none of it stayed with him. Only the silence did. The same silence he carried from childhood. The same silence that now killed for him. The same silence he would carry to Ziost, where something inside him would finally break. Ziost did not bleed. It swallowed. Unlike Balmora's burning skies or Corellia's shattered steel, Ziost offered no fire, no color, only ash, stone, and silence. A world once holy to the ancient Sith, now reclaimed by the Empire not through diplomacy but through desecration. The Force itself trembled there, thick with memory and ghosts. And Vengean was sent to finish what others had failed to begin. The mission was clear: crush the last Republic garrisons hiding within Ziost's temple cities, and ensure no Jedi remained to stir resistance among the native Sith cults. The world was a tomb, but beneath the ruins, breath still moved. The Empire wanted it silenced. So they sent their quietest weapon. Vengean did not arrive with armies. He brought 24 handpicked operatives, Sith acolytes, bounty hunters, commandos, elite, ruthless, nameless. They landed under a storm-shrouded sky and disappeared into the ruins before the sun could rise. 3 days later, the ruins collapsed. Not from bombardment, from the inside. The native cults were found butchered in ceremonial halls, Republic bunkers breached from beneath. Jedi Knights stripped of their sabers and strung up in meditative positions as if someone had tried to freeze their final thoughts in place. No explosions, no open battles, just absence. Vengean left no trace of movement, only the end result. A Force-sensitive Republic officer, one of the few survivors, was found weeks later in orbit. His report was disjointed. His eyes refused to focus. But one line stood out. He said, "It wasn't war. It was watching a planet forget how to breathe." That was Vengean's gift. He didn't conquer territory. He erased meaning. The ancient Sith temples were left untouched. But something inside them had changed. The old holocrons no longer whispered. The dark side felt heavier, slower, as if something had fed on it and fallen asleep. Rumors spread among the Empire's own ranks that Vengean had performed a rite, that he had offered the Jedi as sacrifices to the planet itself, that he had spoken to the tombs and they had answered. None of it was ever proven. But none of it was denied. When the Sith Lords overseeing the campaign reviewed the results, they saw total victory, minimal casualties, no lingering resistance. They sent commendations, offers of command, whispers of elevation to the Dark Council. Vengean refused them all. He did not want rank. He wanted distance. Because something had shifted on Ziost, not in the war, but in him. For the first time, he had tasted what it meant to be worshipped. Not by people, not by peers. By the Force. By the shadow that lingered beneath it. He began to dream, not in images but in pressure, the weight of something ancient leaning over him, watching, as if the rituals carved into Ziost's walls were not just history but prophecy. And now, that prophecy had taken notice of him. The others around him saw his silence deepen, his voice grow more precise, his violence more focused. There were no outbursts, no declarations, but in every command he gave, there was a new clarity. The war was no longer the test. He was, and the galaxy was watching to see if he would become what the Force had hinted at. He returned to Drummond Cass briefly, not to rest but to stand before the Council. They spoke of his actions. They questioned his methods, but when he looked at them, they fell silent. Not because of respect, because they knew. Ziost had not changed him. It had revealed him. When the Dark Council gave him the name, he said nothing. They offered it not with ceremony, but with calculation. Not as a reward, but a label, a mark they could use. His deeds were undeniable. His silence legendary. He had achieved more through absence than most lords did through war. And so the name was given. Darth Vengean. Not a title born of lineage. Not a mantle passed down. It was a scar, spoken aloud. And Thagis accepted it the way he accepted everything else without a word. He left the council chambers alone. No procession. No acolytes. No applause. Only his shadow, following him into the storm. On paper, he had everything now: command over fleets, authority over sectors, influence within the highest circles of the Empire. But power did not fill the void he carried. Nothing ever had. Not Corellia, not Balmora, not Ziost. Because Vengean had never truly wanted power. He wanted permission. Permission to let the thing inside him speak. The thing made of cold rooms and electric pain. The thing that watched him bleed and learned not to flinch. He began planning new offensives, not to win battles, but to create silence. Entire campaigns were built around disruption, fear, and withdrawal. Planets surrendered without resistance. Colonies went dark. Even the Republic's Jedi generals could not predict him. Because he had no ambition, only momentum. But behind his success, something else grew. Grief. Not for the dead, not for the Republic, but for the part of himself that had never spoken, that had never been held, that had never been allowed to want anything other than survival. In the still hours between deployments, he would stand alone in the halls of his flagship, unarmored, unarmed, and stare into the stars beyond the viewport. Not in longing, in remembrance. There had been a boy once, years ago, who knelt in the rain and waited for someone to care if he lived. That boy was gone, but Vengean could still feel him sometimes like a scar under armor. There were no funerals in the Empire, no eulogies for what was lost. Only promotion, only advancement, only more names forgotten. And so he buried it quietly, the grief, the memory, the ache. He buried it the way the Sith had taught him. By making it useful, he began training others. Not openly, not with compassion, but with purpose. Silent operatives, isolated killers, students who reminded him of who he once was not. because he wanted to save them, but because he wanted to make sure they survived. It was the only mercy he understood. One of those students would one day rise. One of them would learn too quickly. But that day had not yet come. For now, Darth Vengean remained what the war had made of him, a figure feared by enemies, studied by allies, and obeyed by all. But he knew the truth. He had not been shaped by the Force. He had not been guided by destiny. He had been broken into place, piece by piece, and only the silence had remained. Some said he had no soul, that his power came from the absence of conscience, but they were wrong. He had a soul. He just hadn't heard it speak since he was a child. The seat was not carved from stone or adorned in gold. It was durasteel, cold, simple, heavy, anchored to the center of a room where light was forbidden. The dark council chamber was not a place of comfort. It was a place where silence could kill faster than any blade. Darth Vengean sat without ceremony. His rise had not been heralded with chants or rituals. He had not inherited the title. He had taken it not from a rival, but from the void his actions had created. The council had watched his campaigns. Balmora, Ziost, Corellia. They had seen his silence tear through resistance more efficiently than entire legions. They called him precise. But that wasn't the word. He was inevitable. And so they elevated him, not as an equal, but as a blade, a butcher. Darth Vengean took his seat with the same stillness he had always carried. No oath, no ambition, only weight. And the galaxy shifted around him. He was given authority over military policy, expansion oversight, and discipline within the imperial ranks. But titles meant nothing to him. He didn't wield power like the others. He didn't engage in debate or posture with politics. He acted quickly, completely. When uprisings sparked in the mid-rim, he didn't deploy fleets. He deployed memory. He ordered a surgical strike on one colony, a place known for its neutrality, its culture, its refusal to bow. No survivors, no transmissions. Only a single imperial probe, sent after the smoke cleared, to record the silence. The footage was shown in shadow briefings across 10 systems. No more colonies resisted. When an imperial admiral questioned orders, Vengean didn't threaten him. He replaced him. Mid-campaign, no warning. The admiral's flagship was boarded by silent commandos. No executions, just removal. And in his place, Vengean installed someone no one knew, but everyone obeyed. He had learned long ago. Fear did not need to scream. It only needed to remain. The other counselors were divided. Some feared him. Others tried to manipulate him. But none understood him. They assumed he wanted control, influence, legacy. But Vengean didn't care who remembered him. He only cared that people forgot to disobey. In the quiet, beyond the meetings and declarations, he remained as he had always been, alone. His chambers aboard the flagship Crucible were barren. No servants, no tapestries, just a meditation sphere surrounded by darkness. There, he would sit for hours, eyes closed, listening, not to the Force, to the absence of it. He found comfort in the spaces where nothing stirred, where even memory had no voice. Because that was where he had been born, not in the womb of a mother, but in the silence after every scream had been ignored. Darth Vengean was not like the others. He did not seek to bend the Force to his will. He sought to become what filled the void when the Force looked away. To the outside galaxy, he was myth. Stories of entire cities razed by a command. Fleets that disappeared after a single holotransmission. He did not taunt. He did not threaten. He acted, and the galaxy recoiled. To the Dark Council, he was a necessary instrument, brutal, predictable, disposable. But one man saw him differently. A voice that waited patiently beneath Vengean's shadow. An apprentice who understood that silence could be copied, and then used. His name was Baras, and while others feared the throne Vengean sat upon, Baras had already begun building the steps that would bring him closer to it. There were no more declarations of war, only instructions. By the time Darth Vengean issued a command, resistance had already been calculated into dust. He didn't march. He didn't rally. He sent a list names, sectors, populations, and by the end of the cycle, the galaxy had shifted. Not because it fought back, but because it had learned not to. This was how fear became policy. The Outer Rim fell first, not in battle, but in silence. Colonies that had once flown Republic banners found themselves abandoned not by choice, but by paralysis. Their leaders held emergency meetings, only to realize they had no one left to call. No allies who would answer. No neighbors brave enough to make contact. They remembered what happened to those who spoke too loudly. They remembered Darth Vengean. A mining world in the Tragan expanse, 30,000 settlers, defensible ridges, local militia had once held out against 3 years of imperial pressure. Their leaders were veterans, their bunkers reinforced, their loyalty to the Republic unshakable. One encrypted message reached Vengean's flagship. It wasn't answered. 2 days later, the planet was empty. No craters, no glassing, no signs of orbital bombardment. Just a single broadcast transmitted across nearby sectors. 4 words. This is your warning. That was all it took. Planets began surrendering to his silence. No negotiations. No emissaries. They simply lowered their shields and waited. What frightened them wasn't death. It was the idea of dying without understanding how. Vengean's war was psychological. Not through manipulation that was Baras's craft, but through consequence. He didn't disguise what he was. He made the cost of defiance so absolute, so complete, that systems collapsed from the memory of his name alone. Even the Jedi began to question how to face him. Not because he couldn't be stopped, but because by the time they heard his footsteps, the work was already done. He didn't duel. He dismantled. And still, he asked for nothing. No monuments, no titles, no fealty. He left no messages behind, no manifestos, no legacy statements to inspire fear. Others crafted stories around him. The Emperor's wrath, the hand of dread, the quiet flame. Vengean ignored them all, because fear did not need a face, only continuity. The more power he gained, the more predictable he became. And that predictability made him useful. The Dark Council leveraged his presence like a surgical tool. Send Vengean here, and the uprisings vanish. Send Vengean there and planetary governors fall in line. He wasn't a leader. He was a purge. And he made no complaints. But not everyone saw his silence as strength. Among his own command structure, questions began to surface. Why did Vengean not consolidate? Why did he not demand influence over the ministry? Why did he leave propaganda to the lesser lords? Why did he not care? Baras saw the answers long before others did. Because Baras had been listening since Balmorra. He had watched his master rise and had memorized every step. While Vengean sowed terror, Baras sowed doubt. He began suggesting improvements, strategic adjustments, communications enhancements. Minor things, always respectful, always quiet. Vengean allowed them. not because he trusted Baras, not even because he agreed, but because none of it mattered to him. His work was in motion. The galaxy was still breaking. He didn't need to rule. He only needed to remain feared. But Baras understood something that Vengean had forgotten. Fear fades. It can't be held. And when it does, the galaxy doesn't remember silence. It remembers the voice that speaks after it. Baras learned early that power was not taken. It was inherited from the blind spots of those who already held it. And Darth Vengean had many blind spots. Not in strategy, not in violence, but in politics, the invisible battlefield where words replaced blades and silence could be fatal in ways even Vengean had never imagined. Most apprentices studied their masters to imitate them. Baras studied Vengean to surpass him. He watched the way generals stiffened when Vengean entered a room, how counselors lowered their voices when his name was mentioned, how entire sectors altered their decisions simply to avoid his attention. These reactions fascinated Baras, not because they were earned, but because they were unmanaged. Vengean never shaped his legacy. He never redirected praise, never built a following, never rewrote narratives to protect his future. He simply existed. And existence, Baras realized, could be rewritten. At first, Baras's influence was subtle. A suggestion placed during a briefing, a recommendation whispered during hyperspace travel. Adjustments to Vengean's reports, framed as efficiency updates. He learned how to speak with just enough respect to avoid suspicion, and just enough insight to appear indispensable. Vengean accepted these contributions with indifference, not trust, just disinterest. Baras understood this better than anyone. His master did not care about manipulation, because Vengean did not believe he could be manipulated. It was the same mistake warriors had made for centuries, assuming the battlefield ended where the blade could not reach. But Baras lived in the space beyond that battlefield. He learned how Vengean thought, how he dismissed personal threats, how he reacted to betrayal, which was to say, barely at all. And slowly, Baras began to construct a new version of his master. To commanders, he portrayed Vengean as growing unstable. To governors, he portrayed him as overly ambitious. To fellow Sith, he whispered a different story. Vengean is preparing something, and he will not share it. None of the claims were true, but truth was never required, only fear. Baras did not attack Vengean directly. He attacked his absence. Every moment Vengean chose silence, Baras filled with narrative. Every empty space in the archives, Baras filled with implication. And because Vengean never defended himself, never corrected the stories, never cared what others believed, the galaxy began believing Baras. He expanded his influence by controlling information. He intercepted reports, redirected intelligence streams, and slowly placed his own network of spies beneath Vengean's authority. What began as administrative assistance evolved into shadow control, and Vengean did not notice, not because he was foolish, but because he had never valued the parts of power Baras had mastered: influence, perception, legacy. Vengean thought only of control through consequence. Baras thought of control through inevitability. Yet even as he worked, Baras never showed arrogance. He bowed deeper, spoke softer, appeared loyal. He praised Vengean in public, even as he eroded him in private. He studied the Jedi not to destroy them, but to understand how they spoke about threats. He studied the Council not to join it, but to learn how it justified removal. And over time, he came to a single conclusion. The Sith did not fear losing battles. They feared losing purpose. Baras began framing Vengean as a lord who acted without vision, someone who brought destruction without direction, someone who served the Empire, but no longer shaped it. And the council listened, because every empire fears the weapon it no longer controls. Baras did not draw his blade. He didn't need to. He only had to wait for the moment when the council asked a single question. What happens when Darth Vengean stops serving us? And when that day came, Baras already had the answer prepared. The council never trusted weapons they didn't forge themselves. And Darth Vengean had not been forged. He had emerged, not through lineage, not through influence, but through destruction, through the sheer weight of silence and fear. And now, after years of service, that weight had begun to tilt. He still executed orders. He still crushed resistance. But he no longer listened. He had stopped attending council sessions unless summoned. He no longer reported details. His fleet movements, once precise and terrifying, became unpredictable, not reckless, just detached. As though Vengean no longer fought for the Empire. He fought because it was the only thing left he could feel. And the council, once content to use him, began to wonder if the blade had turned inward. Baras fed those doubts with precision. He compiled reports showing Vengean bypassing protocol, hollow recordings of commanders questioning his judgment, doctored transmissions that hinted at unapproved operations. None of it was direct proof. But in Sith politics, proof was never needed, only momentum. And Baras had momentum. He met privately with council members, not to accuse, only to warn. He spoke softly, carefully. He no longer sees the line between silence and defiance. I fear he acts alone, even against our will. I remain loyal, of course, but I do not believe I am safe. He never once said the word betrayal. He let them say it themselves. And they did, because Vengean had given them nothing to hold on to. No allies, no causes, no legacy. He was not a Sith Lord with ambition. He was a weapon. And weapons that no longer listen get replaced. The council came to Baras in stages, first with questions, then requests, then permission. They didn't want to confront Vengean themselves. They wanted someone else to take the risk. And Baras smiled, because he already had someone in place, his own apprentice, a figure trained in Vengean's blind spots, someone who had studied silence and learned how to survive it, someone who could approach Vengean without triggering suspicion. The plan was already in motion. Baras didn't inform his master. He didn't need to. He only pulled the strings, and as those strings tightened, Vengean remained unaware. Or perhaps, he simply didn't care. He felt the shift in the force. He saw how officers avoided his gaze, how the council sent fewer messages, how his apprentice had grown more confident, more poised. But he said nothing, not out of ignorance, but out of exhaustion. Vengean had spent a lifetime becoming a blade. But blades do not lead. They do not command. They do not shape. They cut until someone decides to sheath them or break them. When the order came, it wasn't public. It wasn't declared. The council whispered it into the shadows, and the galaxy held its breath. Darth Vengean was still in command of fleets, still feared by billions, still capable of devastating entire sectors. But in the end, none of it mattered. Because when a Sith falls, it is never from power. It is from loneliness. The kind of loneliness that begins in childhood, that festers in silence, that grows in obedience, until obedience becomes the only thing you know. Vengean had never built walls. He had become one, And now the council no longer needed him to stand. They needed him to fall. Baras watched from the shadows as the final steps unfolded. His voice calm, his eyes steady, his apprentice already en route. Darth Vengean did not resist. Because deep down, beneath the armor, beneath the name, he had always known. The council never held him. They only waited for the moment they could let go. Victory was no longer enough. Not because it had become rare, but because it had become routine. Darth Vengean still won, still crushed resistance, still issued commands that silenced entire systems. But each conquest left him colder than the last. Entire planets fell to his hand, yet none of them felt like triumphs. His name still carried fear, but fear no longer felt like purpose. He stood at the center of an empire that bowed to his record and felt nothing. He once believed that fear would be enough, that obedience, shaped through pain, would silence the chaos inside him. And for a time, it had. Balmora, Zeost, the corridors of the academy, the fire and screams and silence. He had shaped an identity from ashes and obedience. But now, as the war slowed and the front lines stabilized, he found himself surrounded not by enemies but by administrators, counselors, advisors, strategists. They wanted updates, numbers, schedules. They wanted Darth Vengean, the war hero, to become Darth Vengean, the bureaucrat. And he didn't know how to do that, because he wasn't built for it. He was built to endure, built to outlast, to watch others break and stand in their place. But what happens when there is no more breaking to be done? When all that's left is motion, without meaning? He began retreating into his own silence again, spending hours aboard his ship without speaking to anyone, walking through the command deck while officers stiffened and pretended not to look, reviewing battle maps not because he needed to, but because they were the only things that still made sense. Lines, targets, actions. But even those maps began to blur. He would trace the path of a future assault only to stop halfway, staring at the glowing holograms with a kind of blank stillness, not because the plan was flawed, but because it didn't matter. No matter how many planets fell, the emptiness remained. He thought of Zeost, of the temples, of the silence that felt like home, and wondered why it didn't feel that way anymore. He began walking alone, more often pacing the halls of the Crucible, his flagship, without destination. The crew grew accustomed to his presence, then afraid of it. They began clearing corridors in advance. Some even avoided entire decks. Not because he punished them, but because they could feel it too. The shift, the weight, the unraveling that no one could name. He no longer struck out in rage, no longer barked orders. He simply watched, for hours, for days, listening to the hum of the ship, the soft pulse of the engines, the vibration of hyperspace. And sometimes, he thought he heard voices, not words, not commands, just echoes, like fragments of things he had buried long ago, rising again in the silence he once considered safe. He would turn suddenly, expecting to see someone behind him. There was never anyone there, just shadow, just memory. The galaxy still feared Darth Vengean, but Darth Vengean was beginning to fear himself, not for what he might do, but for what he couldn't feel anymore. He was surrounded by respect, surrounded by history, surrounded by blood. But in all that silence, there was no peace. Only waiting, only listening, and far away in a different chamber, a voice was already speaking his name in whispers. Not with fear, but with intention. The halls of the crucible had never been loud, but now they felt listening. Every step Vengean took echoed farther than it should have. Every door hissed open with a hesitation he could feel in the air. Officers bowed faster, crews spoke softer, and yet behind every respectful gesture, he sensed a tremor. Not fear, expectation. Something was shifting beneath him, like metal warping before it breaks. His command staff had grown disciplined over the years, molded by his silence and precision. They followed his orders without question. But lately, their movements changed. They lingered after meetings. They exchanged glances when they thought he wasn't looking. Reports arrived late, with subtle phrases adjusted. Even routine status updates felt rehearsed. It wasn't rebellion, it was caution, as though they knew something he didn't, or believed something he hadn't been told. Vengean felt it most in the empty hours, in the late-night cycles when the ship dimmed, leaving only the glow of red corridor lights. He would walk those halls, listening to the hum of the engines, listening to the silence. And yet something else seemed to breathe between the walls. Not the echoes of Zayast, not the ghosts of his past. Something new, something alive. One cycle, while passing a communication alcove, he stopped. He didn't know why, just an instinct to pull. The air felt wrong, heavy. Voices drifted from the shadows ahead. Two officers, whispering, "He won't notice. He already has. You're sure Baras has everything in place?" A pause. "As sure as anyone can be. We follow orders." Vengean stepped forward, and the voices froze. One officer turned, face pale. He bowed immediately, head lowered, fear radiating from his skin. The other could barely breathe. "My lord," one whispered, voice cracking. But Vengean walked past them. Not because he didn't care, but because something inside him refused to respond. He felt the weight of their fear, the urgency of their conversation, the unmistakable mention of his apprentice. But none of it ignited him. Not anger, not suspicion, just emptiness, as if the quiet inside him had grown deeper than action could reach. Still, the whispers continued. He heard them in supply corridors, in hangar bays, from the mouths of soldiers who didn't realize how sound traveled. They never spoke loudly. Their words were fragments, suggestions, hints. Baras says, council inquiry, reassignment protocols. Vengean. Always his name, never the truth. He began to wonder if the silence he had mastered was turning against him. If the emptiness he had used to break planets was now breaking him. He had trained himself never to react, never to question, never to feel. And now, when the galaxy finally moved against him, he found himself unable to respond. He still held power. He still commanded fleets. Yet something in him remained, still, detached, waiting. One night, in the meditation chamber, he sat in darkness, letting the hum of the engines carry through his bones. But beneath that hum, he sensed something else faint, distant, yet unmistakably directed at him. A presence, not malicious, not afraid, curious. Baras, his apprentice, had always been ambitious, always careful, always watching. For years, Vengean had allowed it, not because he trusted him, but because Baras's ambition posed no threat to the only thing Vengean valued, silence. But now, that silence was shifting, being shaped, not by him, by Baras. Vengean opened his eyes. The chamber remained empty. Yet for the first time, he understood. He had crushed armies, but he had never learned how to hear whispers. He had always known politics existed beneath the surface, but he never imagined drowning in it. Darth Vengean had built his name through brutality, not negotiation. His power came from the ground, soaked in blood and fire. He had shattered worlds, ended rebellions, and silenced resistance without needing a single alliance. And for years, that had been enough. But power in the Empire was never just about victory. It was about visibility. And Vengean had never cared to be visible. He never gathered followers, never placed allies within the council. He did not fund propaganda wings, nor attend private banquets where influence changed hands with every word. He didn't cultivate loyalty through favors or flattery. His legacy was shaped by action alone. That made him dangerous, but also vulnerable. The council tolerated his silence until it became inconvenient, until systems began questioning his decisions, until the fear he projected began to dim beneath the noise others created. He didn't see the conversations being held behind closed doors. He didn't hear the jokes whispered over shared drinks. He didn't feel the shifting gravity in every sentence spoken around him. But Baras did. Baras had studied the council like a tactician studies terrain. He knew when to speak and when to vanish. He knew who to flatter and who to provoke. He offered truths laced with poison, always subtle, never direct. He sowed doubts like seeds in fertile soil, then stepped back to let others water them. He acts without oversight. He ignores the will of the council. He cannot be reached. And the most dangerous whisper of all, he does not care. It was true, Vengean didn't. Not because he was arrogant, but because he had been trained to survive pain, not politics. When his instructors beat him, they never asked for charm. When commanders called him to battle, they never demanded persuasion. The Empire had shaped him into a weapon, and then punished him for refusing to become anything else. And now that weapon was being slowly taken apart. He noticed his orders were delayed, that governors questioned his decisions more openly, that admirals who once obeyed without question now required justification, not loudly, not rebelliously, just enough. He requested reinforcements for a border siege. The reply was late, buried in procedural delays. He called for an audience with 2 counselors. They declined, citing scheduling conflicts. He asked Baras for clarity on a broken supply chain. Baras smiled and said he would look into it. No answers ever came. Each move was small, isolated, harmless when seen alone. But together, they formed a noose. And Vengean didn't know how to cut it. Because this wasn't a fight he could win with fear. There were no enemy lines to break, no generals to outmaneuver. Only quiet rooms, unseen hands, and conversations he would never be invited to hear. His silence, once his greatest strength, was now his cage. The halls of power were filled with voices, and Vengean had never learned to raise his. Baras filled that silence for him, smiling, bowing, offering help, while his influence wrapped around Vengean's command like a slow, invisible fire. The council didn't order Vengean's fall. They let it happen. They waited for the fear to fade, for the victories to feel distant, for the legend to become too quiet to protect itself. And in that silence, Baras began rehearsing his final speech. The one that would explain why the Empire no longer needed its blade. The signs had been there for months. The shifts in protocol, the absent acknowledgments, the officers who no longer stood as straight when he entered a room. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't betrayal. It was erosion, slow, silent, and thorough. And Darth Vengean let it happen. Not out of ignorance, not out of pride, but because part of him believed this was always how it would end. He had outlived fear, outlived purpose, and now he was outliving himself. When the final notice arrived, a brief transmission from the council, requesting a private report on his recent deployments, he stared at it longer than he should have. Not because of what it said, because of what it didn't. There was no urgency, no real reason to summon him, no accusations, no context, just an invitation. And Vengean knew what that meant. He wasn't being questioned, he was being measured, weighed, prepared for removal. He didn't respond, not with denial, not with resistance. He simply turned off the message, because the truth was simple and cruel. The storm had been building around him, and he had chosen not to see it, not because he was blind, but because he no longer believed he was meant to stand in it. For years, he had been the storm. Now he was only the silence it left behind. Baras had stopped speaking to him directly. Their exchanges had grown short, transactional. His apprentice still performed his duties, still bowed, but the deference felt hollow now, as if rehearsed for an audience Vengean couldn't see. He noticed how Baras had stopped asking questions. That was how Vengean knew it was over. The true apprentice always asked questions, always sought the boundaries of power. But once those boundaries were mapped, and the successor had no more to learn, they waited, and Baras was waiting. Not with a blade, with a plan. Vengean walked the observation deck that evening, watching the stars bend as the crucible drifted through hyperspace. The stars had always comforted him. They didn't judge, didn't betray, didn't whisper. But now, even they felt distant. He remembered the boy in the storm, the one who obeyed to survive, the one who broke another's face to be noticed, the one who accepted a name that meant punishment. And he realized something he'd never allowed himself to think before. He hadn't risen through strength. He had surrendered to it. At every point in his life, he had submitted to the next weight, the next expectation, the next pain, not to overcome it but to become it. And now, that pain had reached its final shape. It looked like a council who no longer feared him. It sounded like whispers spoken in rooms he could never enter. It felt like the silence of a ship he no longer controlled. He could have struck first. He could have turned the fleet, could have purged the decks, could have ended Baras in a dozen different ways. But he didn't, because for the first time in his life, he was tired, not from battle, from being used, and in the end, he chose the one thing he'd never been allowed before: stillness. Let Baras move. Let the council shift. Let the storm break. He would not run from it. Because deep down, beneath the armor and the blood and the silence, there was nothing left to protect. Only memory, and the shadow of a boy who had once hoped someone would stop him before it was too late. Baras never raised his voice. He never challenged openly, never offered correction in public. In every meeting, in every council session, in every holocall that passed through the command deck, Darth Baras spoke of Vengean with respect. Not forced, not overdone, just enough to disarm suspicion. My master has authorized this personally. Lord Vengean's strategy is unmatched. We are fortunate to serve under his vision. But beneath every word was a quiet erosion. Because praise, when wielded carefully, can become poison. And Baras had learned exactly how much to use. He knew the truth. The council no longer needed evidence. It needed plausibility. And the more Baras celebrated Vengean's power, the more isolated Vengean became from those who used to serve him. In public, Baras made himself small. In private, he made himself indispensable. He controlled the briefings before Vengean entered the room. He coordinated the officers who filtered what reports were seen. He adjusted fleet responses just enough to sow confusion, then quietly corrected the errors before they reached Vengean's ears. To Vengean, it looked like competence. To the Council, it looked like control. Baras played both sides like a veteran conductor, and the music he composed was not for celebration. It was for a funeral. One by one, Baras replaced those closest to Vengean. Not with traitors, not with loyalists, with doubt. Commanders who hesitated just slightly when given orders. Advisors who asked innocent questions about long-standing procedures. Attendants who adjusted the tone of their reports to make the situation seem more unstable than it was. And every time Vengean grew frustrated, Baras was there, listening, understanding, offering solutions that quietly removed the next piece of the structure holding Vengean up. My lord, perhaps this admiral is not aligned with your vision. With your permission, I will personally oversee the transition. You deserve only the most loyal in your inner circle. And Vengean, already weary from battlefields and the slow death of his own silence, allowed it. Because Baras didn't sound ambitious. He sounded devoted. That was the brilliance of the act. Baras made his loyalty a tool of betrayal. He never claimed power. He protected it. He became the one Vengean didn't question, the one the Council trusted to speak on Vengean's behalf when Vengean no longer showed up. The one who held every thread, until there were none left for Vengean to grasp. Others saw it. A few officers, veterans from Ziost or Balmora, felt the shift. They whispered their concerns. Some even approached Vengean directly. But he dismissed them. Baras had always spoken well of him, had always followed orders, had never once asked for more than was given. And Vengean, trained to trust action and silence, never looked beyond the surface. He had survived lies before. But never lies shaped like praise. It wasn't until his orders began to return, altered, redacted, rerouted, delayed that Vengean started to understand. Not in full, not in time, but enough to feel the shape of something unraveling beneath him. He stood on the bridge of the Crucible one evening, watching a sector report replay for the third time. A transmission Baras had sent in his name, directing a withdrawal Vengean hadn't authorized. He didn't speak, didn't call for clarification. He simply watched the transmission until it ended, then stared at the holotable as the stars flickered in red. Baras had spoken his name, had worn his voice, and no one questioned it. Because when praise becomes the lie you trust most, you never see the dagger underneath. It began with a missing supply fleet, then a delayed report, then the reassignment of a trusted officer. No warning, no explanation, just a name removed from the manifest and replaced with a stranger who bowed too deeply and spoke too carefully. Each incident alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern, and only one man was at the center of it, Baras. He never claimed credit, never called attention to himself. But every problem led to a gap that Baras offered to fill. He never accused, only suggested. He never overstepped, only offered solutions. And each time, the Council watched him with a little more trust. Because Baras understood the truth of power in the Sith Empire, it didn't shift through battle. It shifted through absence. And Darth Vengean, for all his strength, was beginning to disappear. Baras controlled the information flow now. From intelligence networks to command logs, everything passed through filters designed to weaken Vengean's reach. Messages were lost, plans were misinterpreted, orders were updated under current protocols. He built redundancy into the system's new protocols, new chains of command, all under the banner of strengthening the war effort. And Vengean, still haunted by the void inside him, still wandering corridors in silence, allowed it. Because a part of him wanted to be replaced. Not by Baras. By stillness. Baras filled that stillness expertly. He began making decisions Vengean hadn't authorized. Relocating troops. Restructuring planetary defenses. Engaging in conversations with council members behind closed doors. But none of it was done publicly. None of it challenged Vengean directly. That was the genius. Baras didn't remove his master. He emptied him. By the time Vengean noticed how far things had slipped, he was commanding only the illusion of power. His fleets no longer moved at his word. His governors answered to other channels. Even his holonet authorizations required secondary verification, a protocol Baras himself had helped design. And still, Baras smiled, still bowed, still called him master. The crew aboard the Crucible felt the change too. Officers who once stiffened at Vengean's silence now waited for Baras to speak before they moved. Communications were routed through channels Baras controlled. Security logs began to show edits not obvious, just subtle enough that even the droids couldn't flag them. It wasn't sabotage. It was surgery. Vengean didn't respond with fury. He didn't strike Baras down. He didn't purge the command chain or unleash the Force in a storm of rage. Because he had been trained never to act without purpose. And now, for the first time, he didn't know what purpose remained. He spent more time alone, watching system maps he no longer controlled, reading battle reports filled with Baras's name, listening to warfront briefings that praised strategies he hadn't written. Every shadow around him whispered doubt, but the loudest shadow was smiling. In council meetings, Baras spoke with precision, always respectful, always firm. He referenced Vengean often, as my master envisioned, under Darth Vengean's leadership. But the council no longer looked to Vengean when decisions were made. They looked to Baras, because the apprentice had become the messenger, and the master had become the myth. Darth Vengean once believed that silence was strength, that enduring was the greatest power of all. But Baras had weaponized something far more dangerous. He had weaponized visibility. And with every thread he pulled in the dark, the fabric of Vengean's power unraveled quietly, stitch by stitch, breath by breath. Not with war, not with fire, but with planning and patience. The realization did not strike him like lightning. It came slowly, like a shadow stretching across a room he once believed was safe. Vengean had survived battlefields that broke armies. He had stood against Jedi lines. He had silenced rebellions with a single command. But none of those victories prepared him for the quiet, unraveling now unfolding at the edges of his world. One morning, he stood before the holotable aboard the Crucible, reviewing the next phase of an Outer Rim campaign. It should have been simple. His orders had been clear, his timetable calculated. But the map had changed. Not drastically, just enough. A fleet he had repositioned 2 days earlier was already gone. Reassigned, relocated, moved without his consent. Vengean stared at the blinking indicators for a long time, the silent hum of the deck settling into the marrow of his bones. Officers nearby kept their eyes forward, pretending not to sense the stillness growing behind him. Who authorized this? Vengean finally asked. 6 words. Quiet. Measured. The bridge froze. A communications officer, young and inexperienced, stepped forward with trembling hands. My lord, the order came through secondary command channels. confirmed under your protocol. Vengean's eyes did not move. Show me. The officer hesitated, then activated the recording. A static image flickered into view, and then a voice, smooth, deep, familiar, echoed through the chamber. Baras, speaking in Vengean's name, delivering orders Vengean had never given. No one on the bridge moved. No one breathed. They all knew what it meant, and Vengean finally understood what he had ignored for too long. The apprenticeship bond had always been fragile, a structure of obedience layered beneath the illusion of respect. But Baras had never been obedient. He had been patient, quiet, calculating, a student of shadows. And Vengean, who had mastered silence on war-torn worlds, had never considered that silence could be turned against him. He dismissed the bridge without raising his voice. Officers scattered, grateful to escape the tension. When the room emptied, Vengean remained alone with the fading blue glow of the holotable. He replayed the message twice, not to understand the content, to understand the intention. Baras had not hidden the falsification. He had not disguised his tone. He had not tried to mimic Vengean perfectly, because he didn't need to. The council already believed him. The officers already obeyed him. The empire had already shifted. Vengean was a name now, a symbol, a myth, and myths were easy to control when the living presence behind them stopped speaking. He walked to his meditation chamber, a small, darkened dome at the heart of the ship, and lowered himself to the floor. He tried to steady his breath, tried to hear the calm he once lived within. But it was gone. The silence he had cultivated his entire life no longer protected him. It pressed against him now like a weight, like a voice he could not hear, whispering truths he had tried never to face. He thought of the academy, of the storms, of the first time he obeyed to survive, and for the first time in decades, he wondered if obedience had been the only thing he had ever known. He should have confronted Baras then, should have summoned him, demanded explanation, but he didn't. Because beneath the anger, beneath the realization, beneath the betrayal, there was something else hiding inside him. Acceptance. He had always believed he would fall in battle, blade to blade, fire to fire. But this quiet suffocation, this unraveling through trust, felt almost fitting. He had never learned to fight the war that required a voice, and Baras had counted on that. Baras never rushed the final step. He had waited too long, planned too carefully. This wasn't a kill made in anger. It was a ritual, slow, measured, precise. One that began not with a blade, but with a smile. The council had grown quiet, not silent, just still. Like a room where a decision had already been made, but no one wanted to say it first. Baras didn't speak for them. He simply arrived early to every meeting, provided updates Vengean didn't attend, volunteered explanations for strategies Vengean hadn't approved. They didn't challenge him, because they didn't want to. By now, Baras was the voice they trusted, the shadow they preferred, the apprentice who had become the answer to a question no one wanted to ask out loud. What if Vengean is no longer useful? Baras never said it. He didn't have to. He only waited until someone else said it first. And someone always did. Vengean felt it long before he heard it. A command rerouted. A holoterminal that refused to activate. Security clearances updated without notice. Officers who met his gaze with the same empty calm they once feared in him. Not hatred, not defiance, just inevitability. He returned to his chambers one evening and found them already scanned. Someone had accessed the logs. The intrusion was masked well, but not perfectly. a faint echo in the system. A digital footprint left just deep enough to feel like a warning. Vengean didn't react, because what was there left to protect? He sat alone, staring at the empty table where he once wrote war campaigns that carved new borders into the galaxy. It felt distant now, like a dream remembered from someone else's life. He had built his legacy through silence, but it was a smile that would end him. Baras arrived the next morning, unannounced, polite, prepared. Vengean didn't summon him, didn't request his presence, but there he stood, cloaked in deference, his voice soft, his posture low. "Master," he said, and he smiled, not with arrogance, with finality. Vengean said nothing. He didn't need to. Baras spoke for both of them. "There have been whispers," he began. "Concerns, rumors." He kept his eyes low, the way a loyal servant would. "The council believes clarity is needed." Vengean watched him, and for a moment he didn't see an apprentice. He saw a reflection of the boy he used to be. Obedient, cold, trained to listen, trained to survive. Baras had listened better. "I ask only for the chance to help," Baras continued, "to preserve what you've built, to carry your strength forward." Another smile, another wound. Vengean knew the words were false, but he also knew the gesture was real. This was Baras's final lesson. Not in war, not in power, in replacement. The Sith did not destroy the old ways with fire. They smothered them with flattery. They whispered change into existence. They made loyalty a rope and waited for it to tighten around the throat of the master too proud to cut it. Baras turned to leave, but before he did, he stopped at the door and said the one thing that made the silence inside Vengean finally speak. "Thank you." No malice, no mockery, just acknowledgement. And Vengean, for the first time in years, felt something. Not rage, not betrayal. Pity. Not for Baras, for himself, because the Sith code never warned about trust. And it never said what to do. When your greatest student smiled at you the same way your enemies used to scream. The order came without warning. A call from the Dark Council, urgent and direct, a rogue element in the mid-rim, threatening supply routes, whispering of rebellion. The fleet had to be deployed immediately. Vengean was to lead the strike. No delay, no hesitation. It was exactly the kind of assignment he had once relished. But something felt off. There was no meeting, no briefing, no voice behind the message. Just a holo transmission sealed with council clearance. His ship's systems had already been updated, course locked, resources rerouted, ground assets reallocated. Everything had been arranged without him. And still, he obeyed. Because Darth Vengean was loyal. Not to the council, not to Baras, to the Empire. Even now, with the whispers behind him growing louder, with his grip on the fleet slipping, with his apprentice rising in the dark, he still believed that obedience could serve something larger than himself. So he boarded the Crucible, reviewed the plans, ignored the silence on the bridge, and prepared to strike. The target was a communications hub buried in the forests of Quesh, a toxic world wrapped in fog and chemical decay. The outpost wasn't large, not strategic, but positioned just closely enough to disrupt hyperspace channels along key military lines. It should have been handled by a lesser Sith, a test, a cleanup, not a Lord of the Dark Council. Not him. But Vengean went anyway, because the Empire had asked, because the system still had rules, and because a part of him, the part that had survived Dromund Kaas, Balmorra, and Zayast, needed to move. Stillness had betrayed him. Silence had failed him. Maybe war would speak to him again. The crucible emerged from hyperspace over Quesh like a blade tearing into a wound. The command crew snapped to motion, but none of them looked at him. They followed procedure, sent probes, deployed preliminary scans, and waited. No resistance, no defense. The outpost was active, but quiet, almost inviting. Vengean narrowed his eyes. It was too perfect. He ordered the landing anyway. His shuttle touched down near the edge of the compound. Thick, yellow fog curled around the durasteel walls. Sensors flickered from static. No alarms, no gunfire. Just the sound of toxic wind blowing across forgotten terrain. He walked forward alone. No guards, no honor guard, no crowd of fearful technicians. Just a door already open, waiting for him. Still, he didn't hesitate. Because Darth Vengean didn't retreat from shadows. He stepped inside the compound halls dimly lit, security droids offline, terminals blinking in standby. The air was heavy, the silence deeper than he remembered. And then, footsteps. Not many, just one pair, steady, measured, not from behind, from ahead. Vengean stopped at the corridor's end. A figure approached cloaked, masked, but unmistakably sent. He didn't need to ask who they were. He already knew. Baras hadn't come. He had sent someone better. The perfect weapon. The one meant to replace him. Vengean didn't reach for his saber. Not yet. He just looked at the figure standing before him. Young, focused, ready. The apprentice of the apprentice. Sharpened to pierce the one blade the Empire could no longer control. And Vengean understood the truth. This wasn't a mission. It was a sentence. Signed by the Council, sealed by Baras, and carried out by the very system he had once served without question. The young warrior did not speak. They stood at the end of the corridor, blade unlit, posture calm, not hostile, not afraid, simply present as if they had been waiting for Vengean long before he arrived on Quesh. And Vengean understood. This was not an ambush, it was an appointment. He stepped forward slowly, the chemical fog drifting through the doorway behind him like a dying breath. The outpost lights flickered overhead, casting faint shadows across the warrior's mask. It was a simple mask, functional, empty, a mask worn by someone who had not yet earned a face. Vengean studied them, young, disciplined, efficient in their stillness, a reflection of someone he used to be. The warrior finally spoke, a voice clear but impersonal. "My master sends his regards." No name was offered, none was needed. Baras had written this message himself. Vengean said nothing. He didn't ask the obvious questions. He didn't question Baras's courage or loyalty. He didn't demand an explanation from the Council. Because he already knew. He had seen this pattern before, not on battlefields, but in political chambers where power shifted through quiet removal rather than open confrontation. The warrior continued, "You are ordered to surrender your command, by decree of the Dark Council." There it was. The truth spoken plainly, but the tone held no triumph. Only duty. Vengean tilted his head slightly. "And if I refuse?" The warrior did not hesitate. "Then you will be removed." Not killed, removed. Erased from the structure he had helped build. Forgotten. Vengean felt a faint echo inside him. Not anger, not grief. Something quieter. Something almost like recognition. Baras had learned well. He had sent someone who did not fear him. Someone who had never known him. Someone shaped not by admiration, but by instruction. A perfect tool for a master who had mastered politics. Vengean's hand drifted toward his saber. The warrior mirrored the movement exactly, not out of nervousness, but because that was what they had been trained to do. "Do you understand why you were sent?" Vengean asked quietly. The warrior's answer was immediate. "To execute the council's will." Vengean shook his head once. "No. You were sent because your master wants to prove he has already taken my throne." The warrior didn't reply. They didn't need to. The silence said everything. Vengean took a slow breath. The air tasted of metal and toxin. "Tell me, do you believe in him?" The warrior's posture shifted barely, an almost imperceptible tightening of the spine. "I believe in the Empire. My master serves it." A perfect response. Not loyalty. Obedience. The same obedience Vengean had once confused for purpose. His fingers brushed the emitter of his saber. "Do you believe he serves the Empire?" This time, the pause was longer. Enough to reveal doubt. Enough for Vengean to see the truth. They weren't just here to replace him. They were being tested too. A final trial, forged in Baras's ambition, designed to determine if they were worthy of becoming the next blade. And Vengean was the whetstone. He exhaled slowly, letting the years settle behind his eyes. "Baras has already taken my place. Whether I stand or fall, he has already decided." The warriors said nothing. They simply activated their lightsaber, the red glow illuminating the corridor like a wound opened in the air. Vengean ignited his own. Blue light, cold, steady, a reminder of the man he might have become if the galaxy had shaped him differently. The two stood facing each other, sabers humming softly. Not enemies, not rivals, just roles in a script written long before either of them stepped onto this poisoned world. Vengean raised his blade. The warrior mirrored him. And in that instant, Vengean understood the final truth. He wasn't fighting for survival. He was fighting to decide how he would be forgotten. Their blades clashed in silence. No declarations, no threats, no force lightning or taunts hurled across a ruined chamber. Just movement, clean, practiced, deliberate. Two weapons, forged in different fires, now colliding in the cold fog of a forgotten world. Vengean fought like a wall collapsing in slow motion. Each strike heavy, each step measured. He did not move quickly, he did not need to. For years he had carried the weight of command. He had let silence become his armor. In this moment, it wrapped around him like a second skin. But the warrior across from him moved like lightning remembered. Precise, balanced, efficient. There was no hesitation in their blade, only intent. Baras had trained them well. Not to kill Vengean, to replace him. Every parry, every redirection, every counter was a lesson made flesh. A movement learned by studying the man they were sent to bury. The warrior knew Vengean's stances, his weaknesses, his pauses. They weren't guessing. They had been taught. And that was what wounded Vengean more than the saber cut slowly forming across his cloak. This was not betrayal by surprise. It was betrayal through study. The duel stretched into the inner corridors of the outpost. Pipes hissed with steam. Lights blinked overhead, dying from neglect. Vengean fought with power, using the force in bursts not to dominate, but to hold. He didn't strike to kill. He struck to be understood. Because this wasn't a fight between Sith Lords. It was a conversation between two silences. The warrior pressed harder, faster now. Red blade slashing through the mist. Vengean deflected the blow, turned, and slammed a hand forward. A shockwave of force energy sent the warrior skidding backward, boots tearing lines in the metal floor. They recovered quickly. No anger, no panic, just recalibration. Vengean stepped closer. "You don't know what you are yet," he said. The warrior tilted their head, mask still expressionless. "I do," Vengean continued. "You're not Baras's heir. You're his echo. You wear the face he sculpted. But one day, he'll ask you for more than obedience." The warrior didn't answer, but they hesitated. And for Vengean, that was enough. He pressed forward, saber whirling in wide arcs. Not to kill but to force doubt. Every blow carried history. Every motion whispered, "I made this path before you did." For a moment, the warrior fell back. Then steadied. Then surged forward again, stronger now. Because that doubt wasn't weakness. It was fuel. They fought through a chamber filled with flickering consoles. Sparks showered from damaged cables above. The hum of their sabers echoed off steel walls. Vengean's breath slowed. His grip tightened. He could feel the end approaching. But it didn't frighten him. Because for the first time in years, he wasn't empty. He wasn't a title. He wasn't a myth. He was present. He stepped forward with renewed focus, blade sweeping upward, catching the warrior off guard, their saber thrown high, a brief break in defense. He stopped, blade inches from the warrior's chest. He looked into the mask, into the silence behind it, and he said, "This isn't your victory." The warrior stood frozen. Then, slowly, raised their own blade to Vengean's throat. Red glow met blue, two ends of the same history. Neither moved, neither blinked. And in that stillness, Vengean whispered, "I was never your enemy." The warrior said nothing, but their hands didn't tremble, because they weren't here for vengeance. They were here because someone had to be. Vengean didn't lower his blade, but he didn't strike again, and neither did the apprentice. They stood together in that half-lit chamber, sabers hissing quietly against each other, two shadows frozen in the space between war and silence. Somewhere in the back of the outpost, wind howled through broken vents. The structure groaned. But here, there was only stillness. And in that stillness, something in Vengean began to dissolve. Not his strength, not his focus, his purpose. Because all along, obedience had been his truth. He had obeyed the Empire, obeyed his training, obeyed the silence inside him, believing that loyalty was the highest form of strength. And now, obedience had brought him here. Not to victory, to replacement. He remembered the moment he accepted his name, Vengean, a name meant to cut, to destroy, to punish. He had carried it like a weapon, but he'd never chosen it. It had been assigned. And the man before him, younger, faster, forged in cold purpose, carried that same weight now. Not as rebellion, as duty. Baras had not created an assassin. He had created another servant. Vengean saw it now, the way the apprentice moved without personal hatred, the way they followed orders with precision, the way their mask revealed nothing because nothing had been given to them to protect. He wasn't dying by betrayal. He was dying by design. The warrior took a step back, not in retreat, in invitation, an offer, to keep fighting, to make this end violent, loud, legendary. But Vengean didn't move. He looked at the blade in his hand, the same blade that had enforced fear across half the outer rim, the same blade that had earned him a place on the Dark Council, the same blade that now shook not from weakness but from memory. He deactivated it. The chamber dimmed instantly. The apprentice didn't react. Vengean straightened, lifted his chin. His voice was quiet. "I won't be remembered. It wasn't a question. It was a confession. The apprentice kept their saber active, the hum rising slightly, a warning, a question. But Vengean only nodded once. "You'll learn," he said. "The silence doesn't make you strong. It just makes you easy to replace." He stepped back from the fight, not in surrender, in finality. No anger, no fear, no grief, just stillness. For the last time, the apprentice hesitated, then struck. One clean motion, quick, merciful, a red blur through the fog. Vengean didn't cry out. He didn't fall dramatically. He staggered once, just enough to touch the wall, just enough to leave a single dark smear across the metal as his knees gave out. He sat there, back against the wall, eyes open, still breathing, still aware. The apprentice deactivated their saber. The red vanished. Vengean looked up at them, lips barely moving. "I trained you, and didn't know it." The warrior didn't answer, couldn't, because this wasn't their victory. It was their warning. Vengean's eyes closed slowly, not in defiance, not in regret, but in release. There was no audience, no council present to witness it, no last words recorded in a Sith archive, only the sound of toxic wind whispering through steel halls, only a body that had once terrified systems, now silent on a forgotten floor, and a servant who had followed every order, until the final one asked him to disappear. This was not the death of a tyrant. It was the death of a tool, a blade laid down, a ghost unspoken, a loyalty that outlived its usefulness. Darth Vengean died as he lived, in silence. Quesh was never meant to be remembered. A poisoned planet, forgotten by history, hidden beneath layers of chemical fog and corporate scars. The battles fought here never made the archives. No monuments, no heroes, only ash and silence. It was fitting, because Darth Vengean had not come here to win. He had come here to end. The duel was over. His body had fallen slowly, without ceremony inside the walls of a dead compound. No soldiers surrounded him. No droids called out alerts. No council arrived to confirm what they had already decided. The only one who remained was the apprentice, Baras's apprentice. A silent figure standing above him, saber dimmed, posture still. They didn't move for a long time, not out of respect, out of design, because their mission wasn't to understand Vengean. It was to erase him. And the Empire had no use for funerals. Outside, the wind howled across the cracked landing platform. Toxins hissed from broken pipes. Overhead, storm clouds thickened, heavy with chemical rain. Somewhere beyond the fog, the crucible waited its crew unaware, or perhaps pretending not to be. Baras had arranged every detail. He knew the council wouldn't ask questions, and the apprentice would not disobey. Vengean had once believed that death would come in fire aboard a starship, perhaps, or in the center of a war zone, surrounded by screams and scorched metal. But that had always been a myth. The truth was quieter. A mission, a corridor, a strike. And now, silence. The apprentice knelt, not out of mourning, out of completion. They reached toward the comms console on the wall and transmitted a coded signal. Not a message, not a name, just a confirmation. The target was neutralized. Nothing more. No body recovered. No statement released. The council didn't need closure, only compliance. Baras would handle the narrative, a quiet transfer of duties, a formal update to the chain of command. Vengean had gone dark, disappeared into the fog of war, assumed dead in service to the Empire. It was cleaner this way. It was useful. And that's what the Sith valued most. The apprentice stood again and stared at the body. The armor scarred, the hands still clenched. The mask of silence that Vengean had worn his entire life, now finally broken by the one thing he could never control: irrelevance. They activated the room's emergency purification protocol, an environmental safeguard designed to cleanse chemical spills. This time, it would be used to burn a man. Red light filled the chamber. Flames sparked along the vents. The air shimmered, and Darth Vengean warlord, Executioner, Dark Counselor was reduced to heat and smoke, his ashes swept into a world that never remembered anything it swallowed. No eulogy, no monument, only vapor, only fog. The apprentice walked away without looking back, because this wasn't a victory. It was a procedure, a memory deleted, a file closed. The Sith would not speak of Vengean again. Not in meetings, not in history. The name would fade, used only in cautionary tones or political whispers. He had served. He had obeyed. And now he was gone. And Baras? He would not mourn. He would smile. Because the battlefield had been chosen long before sabers ignited. And the outcome had never been in doubt. Darth Vengean didn't fall in battle. He was retired in silence. By the very structure he gave everything to protect. The duel was brutal, but not because of its violence. Because it was never supposed to happen. There was no prophecy attached to it. No grand conflict between philosophies or rival legacies. Just two Sith, one standing in obedience, the other fading in silence, colliding inside a forgotten outpost no one would ever visit again. Vengean had not drawn his blade for glory. He had drawn it to remember himself, to move with weight again, to remind the Force and maybe himself that he had once been real. But even that truth came too late. The apprentice fought with perfect clarity. Not rage, not pride. They weren't here to conquer Vengean. They were here to carry out Baras's will. And that's why they won. Because Vengean wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting to not be erased. He used strength, yes, used the Force, used the old stances, the deep cuts, the anchoring presence that once shattered resistance on Balmorra and Ziost. But something in him was gone. Not power, belief. He no longer believed the Empire needed him. And in the Empire, belief was the difference between death and legacy. The duel moved from corridor to chamber, from steel to smoke. Sparks lit the walls, pipes burst under pressure. Their sabers hissed as they clashed red against blue, echoing in the emptiness like ghosts arguing over a grave. No one was watching. There would be no records. No witnesses to claim truth or fiction. The only people who would ever know what happened here were the two locked in motion. Vengean struck with heavy intent, trying to break the rhythm, trying to interrupt the programming behind the apprentice's strikes. But they adapted. Baras had trained them well not to be creative, but to be flawless. And flawless beats fading. Every time. At one point, Vengean landed a blow not deep, but enough to slow the apprentice. Their shoulder dipped, breath hitched. A pause. And in that breath, Vengean saw something behind the mask. Not fear, recognition, a flicker. A moment of knowing that this duel should never have been theirs. That they were simply continuing a script written by someone else. But it passed. Because recognition wasn't disobedience. And the apprentice had not been sent to question. They had been sent to end. Their blade came faster now. Red light blurred through the fog. Vengean blocked, parried, stumbled. And as he fell back against the wall, he realized he wasn't angry, he was tired of surviving systems that didn't care. of serving voices that only whispered when it was time to kill, of being a name others feared, but no one understood. This wasn't how Sith Lords were meant to fall, but it was how tools were discarded, and Baras had made sure of it. Vengean caught the apprentice's blade on his own, locked it in place, their faces close, breathing labored, sparks dancing between them. He could have ended it there, could have forced one final moment of dominance, but he didn't, because he saw himself, not in the warrior, in the process, a blade sharpened by obedience, a soul trained to vanish. He let go, and the apprentice, trained to complete without pause, did the rest. The saber struck. Vengean staggered once, and the duel ended. Not with a scream, not with a legend, just a step backward into darkness. A duel that should never have been fought, because its outcome was never in doubt. Darth Vengean died alone, not on a starship bridge surrounded by loyal officers, not before the Dark Council in a final display of defiance, not in the center of a battlefield carved into legend. He died on a poisoned world, no map bothered to label, in a room lit by failing lights, with only the soft echo of a deactivated lightsaber to mark the moment. His body slumped to the floor with a sound too small for a lifetime of fear. The warrior stood above him, breathing slow and steady. There was no triumph in their stance, no satisfaction. They hadn't won a duel. They had executed a command. Vengean wasn't their enemy, only their assignment. And assignments were not mourned. Outside, Quasha's toxic winds blew against the outpost walls, rattling loose panels and sending dust swirling across the floor. The planet did not know a Sith Lord had fallen. It did not care. And soon, neither would the Empire. Because Vengean's death wasn't meant to be seen. It was meant to be absorbed quietly by a system that consumed loyalty and buried the remnants without ceremony. The apprentice knelt beside the body, checking for signs of life not out of compassion but efficiency. The Empire demanded certainty. After a brief scan, they stood and activated their comms. Target neutralized. 2 words, spoken calmly. A lifetime reduced to a confirmation code. There was no response at first. Only the static hum of encrypted channels. Then a voice, smooth, confident, familiar, replied. Baras. Good. Proceed. Not well done. Not return home. Not even ensure the body is secured. Just proceed. Because Vengean was not a threat now. He was an inconvenience removed. The apprentice clipped their saber to their belt, turned away, and began unlocking the outpost's terminal systems. There was a protocol in place one Baras himself had designed to ensure that no debris, no DNA, no trace of the target remained. A false chemical leak, a structural failure, a reactor overload masked as an accident. A Sith Lord would vanish into environmental logs. No one would investigate. No one would question. Not when Baras provided the explanation. Not when the Council preferred silence over inquiry. Vengean lay where he fell, eyes half open, staring at the ceiling, his expression unreadable. Not peaceful, not tormented, just empty. The same emptiness that had followed him since childhood. The same stillness that had once been his strength, then his protection, then the hollow that Baras used to destroy him. A faint tremor shook the outpost. The apprentice triggered the purge. Vents opened. Ignition coils activated. Flames crawled across the floor in slow, serpentine ribbons, not fierce, but deliberate. A controlled burn, engineered for efficiency rather than spectacle. The fire reached Vengean's cloak first. The fabric curled inward, blackening. Then the armor. Then the man beneath it, his body did not convulse, did not tighten, did not resist. He had accepted this ending long before the flames touched him. The apprentice watched for a moment, not out of cruelty, but procedure. Their mask reflected the glow, distorted and red, shaping them into a silhouette that resembled neither hero nor villain, only replacement. When the flames rose too high, they turned away. Outside, the platform trembled beneath the chemical winds. The atmosphere thickened with ash and smoke. The apprentice walked through it slowly, leaving behind the one person who had shaped the war and silenced worlds reduced now to drifting particles. A Sith Lord, consumed by a planet that would not remember him. No hymns, no witnesses, no legacy, only fire, only fog, only a death without echoes. Because in the Empire, even power can die quietly, especially when no one wants to hear its last breath. By the time the fire died, nothing remained. No armor, no bones, no sign that Darth Vengean had ever stood in that room, much less died in it. The outpost systems shut down one by one, the emergency purge complete. Its logs sealed, its sensors wiped. Only silence returned to quash heavier now, but unchanged. There would be no recovery team. No report sent to the public holonet. No speech from the Dark Council acknowledging his fall. Baras would not call attention to the operation. He would move quickly, assuming Vengean's responsibilities, citing emergency transitions, praising his master's sacrifice in service to the Empire, in just enough detail to sound honorable, but not enough to invite inspection. It would work. Because the Empire never cared how its enforcers disappeared, only that they didn't leave questions behind. And Vengean had never been the kind of man who left questions. Only fear, only silence. Baras's apprentice departed the outpost on schedule. Their shuttle lifted into the yellow mist, vanishing from the poisoned sky without ceremony. The Crucible, once Vengean's flagship, now followed a new path, its crew redirected under Baras's oversight. The bridge logs quietly purged. The ship didn't mourn. The systems didn't hesitate. The codes changed, and the galaxy moved on. On Dromundkars, rumors whispered in the corners of the citadel. Nothing confirmed, nothing denied. Just silence, the kind that Sith understood better than truth. One day he was present. The next, replaced. Some said he had been reassigned. Others claimed he was pursuing a secret campaign beyond known space. A few dared to whisper that Baras had finally done what all apprentices were trained to do. But no one investigated, because no one wanted to know. Legacy in the Empire was earned through visibility, through power, titles, networks, and Vengean had never built any of those. He had relied on fear, on strength, on consequence. And fear fades. Without record, without repetition, without someone willing to speak your name. Baras ensured Vengean's name was spoken only once more in a closed council chamber, where he stood alone and bowed deeply. "My master is no longer with us," he said, his voice calm, his face unreadable. "I ask to continue his service, to preserve his legacy." None of the councillors interrupted. None of them asked how Vengean had died, because they had already given Baras permission to write the end of that story, and he had done it perfectly. Vengean's seat was not left empty. It was reassigned, his fleets redistributed, his projects absorbed, his files deleted or rewritten. No statues fell, because none had ever been raised. The fire had done its job. It did not just consume a man. It consumed the proof that he had ever mattered. But somewhere, far from the capital, Far from the cold palaces of Sith power, there were still echoes. Old soldiers who remembered the silence that walked before Vengean's blade. Planets that still bore the scars of his campaigns. Children raised on worlds he had once purged, now growing up in the peace his cruelty had bought. And, perhaps, one or two whispers, spoken in dark corners, of a Sith who did not rise through manipulation, who did not speak in courts, who did not chase legacy, but who served until the very end. They would never know his real name. They would never know his final words. But the galaxy he had served, with all its treachery and shadowed victories, would carry one simple truth forward. That sometimes, the most loyal blade is the first to be discarded, and its flame, no matter how hot, leaves no warmth behind. Only smoke, only silence, only the memory of a fire that no one wanted to remember. The day after Vengean died, nothing changed. Ships still patrolled the Hydean Way. Fleets still gathered at Kar City. The war machine didn't stutter, not even for a moment. Because the Empire wasn't built on individuals, it was built on control. And control meant choosing who was remembered and how. Baras returned to the council chambers with no grief in his voice, no hesitation in his step. He didn't speak of betrayal or triumph. Instead, he explained Vengean's absence as if it were a logistical inconvenience. He deviated from the will of the council, he said. A necessary correction was made. No names, no accusations, just enough detail to silence questions and too little to start new ones. The council did not press him. They had already seen the signs. Vengean had grown volatile, reckless, and worse, irrelevant. And in the Sith Empire, irrelevance was indistinguishable from treason. So Baras rewrote the truth. He planted evidence, changed reports, manipulated communiques to show that Vengean had diverted resources, violated protocols, acted without oversight. The whispers began to spread, that he had hoarded power, ignored the chain of command, and perhaps conspired against the council itself. There was no proof, but proof didn't matter. Baras understood that narrative was more powerful than memory, and his version spread fast. Loyal captains who had once served Vengean received new assignments and new warnings. Their loyalty was now measured by how quickly they stopped speaking his name. Some tried to defend him. They were reassigned, silenced, or disappeared. Within weeks, Vengean's files were sealed, his records scrubbed. On Kar City's holoboards, his name was replaced with cold operational updates, fleet movements, tactical shifts, construction reports. The man who had led invasions, crushed rebellions, and reshaped entire sectors was now a footnote. Compromised, reassigned, forgotten. That was the power Baras wielded, and that was the empire Vengean had died serving. The story of his death was even worse than the truth. Baras claimed that Vengean had activated an unauthorized assault deep in Republic space, endangering a fragile Cold War truce. That he had been warned, that he had refused, that he had forced the Council's hand. A quiet execution not of a traitor, but a fallen warhound who no longer knew his place. And to many, it sounded plausible. Because Darth Vengean had never cared about appearances, he had never played politics, never courted allies, never softened his edges. He had always been a sword, and when swords rust, the Empire casts them aside. That's what made Baras so dangerous. Not that he killed his master, but that he did so without leaving a shadow. Even Vengean's own war reports were redacted, edited to suggest recklessness, casualty numbers inflated. civilian strikes fabricated, entire victories reframed as unstable decisions driven by ego or madness. The result was chilling. Vengean didn't just die. He was unmade, turned from a loyal Sith into a cautionary tale, a warning to apprentices who rose too far without understanding the currents beneath them. And in that silence, Baras grew stronger. He absorbed Vengean's fleets, his networks, his influence, and he did it not through violence, but through paperwork, through whispers, through the very thing Vengean had never mastered, perception, because, in the Empire, truth does not survive on its own. It must be guarded, and no one had guarded Vengean's name. Even when the Empire forgets, the galaxy remembers in pieces, not in public records, or honored statues, or commemorative hollows, but in scars, in echoes, in places where silence carries a name too dangerous to speak aloud. Vengean's name became one of those. He had left no memoirs, no disciples loyal beyond reason, no family to claim honor in his death. But he had left something else. Fear, and fear, once buried, tends to whisper. On Balmorra, ruins from his siege, still stood entire districts left twisted by orbital strikes he had ordered. Survivors didn't know his title, but they remembered the man in red armor, the one who walked through fire, the one whose voice, even distorted through a command channel, sounded like it belonged to a weapon, not a person. One child, now grown, remembered his mother crying at the window when the skies turned red. Not because the Republic had failed them, but because Vengean hadn't. On Ziost, among the hollowed buildings scorched in the wake of his campaigns, mercenaries still traded stories. Not of politics, not of tactics, but of a Sith who did not speak in threats, only in final chances. Leave now. That's what one smuggler claimed he'd heard before the orbital cannon destroyed half his convoy. Vengean had given him that warning, because cruelty wasn't the goal, only compliance. That's what made him different. He didn't savor fear. He used it like a lever, simple, cold, necessary. It left survivors unsure whether he had been a monster or just something worse. A man who believed that power was the only language the galaxy would answer. And yet, even within the Empire, there were remnants of his shadow. A data technician on Drummond cars once noticed a pattern buried in encrypted fleet movements, Vengean's old routes, now erased from modern records, still being mirrored by a few loyal captains. Not because they believed he lived, but because they believed he had been right. That Baras, for all his cunning, had not yet earned the same fear. Others, deeper in the intelligence networks, whispered that Vengean had begun to question certain council decisions before his fall, and that his death had not silenced him soon enough. A few redacted transmissions mentioned strategic hesitation, but none explained what that meant. What did a warlord like Vengean hesitate about? Some believed he had started seeing the flaws in the Empire's structure, how infighting weakened them more than the Republic ever could. Others claimed he had tried to warn the Council of corruption within its own ranks, but no one could prove it, because Baras had made sure nothing survived. Still, the whispers didn't stop, because Vengean was never known for eloquence, only clarity, and clarity leaves an impression, especially on those who serve at the edge of order. One bounty hunter, years later, described meeting Vengean during a contract negotiation. He claimed the Sith had looked at him, then at the contract, and said just 2 words, "Don't lie." He hadn't. The bounty had been paid, and the hunter never forgot that voice. Not because it was angry, but because it was tired of deception. tired of false loyalty, tired of being the blade while others pulled the strings. These weren't stories of admiration. No one idolized him. No one painted murals or wrote poems. But the fragments were enough. Enough to suggest that somewhere, beneath the cruelty and obedience, was a man trying to hold on to something no Sith was ever taught to protect. Honor. And in the Empire, honor is a dangerous thing to remember. Legacies are supposed to leave shadows, but Vengean's did not. Not because he lacked power, not because he lacked victories, but because every part of his life had been shaped to serve others, not himself. And when a life is built on obedience, there is nothing left to stand once obedience ends. Baras understood this better than anyone. That is why he never needed to destroy Vengean's achievements, only the context around them. A hero becomes a tyrant when a new narrative is wrapped around his body. A loyal servant becomes a renegade when a single report is rewritten. And Vengean, in death, had no voice to defend himself. The Empire accepted the redacted story without pause. They believed the Council. They believed Baras. They believed whatever kept the machine stable. And stability required that Vengean be remembered not as a martyr or a weapon, but as a mistake, an example, a warning. Power without control is treason. One counselor declared days after his disappearance. They did not mention his name. They didn't have to. Everyone understood the target of the lesson. His seat on the Dark Council was filled within a week. His influence scattered across departments. His loyal captains given new assignments far from each other, preventing cohesion, preventing questions. This was not punishment. It was dissolution. The quiet dismantling of a legacy he never fought to protect. On military datapads, his past victories were attributed to joint task forces. His planetary conquests were reframed as collaborative efforts. His personal strategies efficient, brutal, in 7. Unmistakably his were said to be committee directives. A man who had shaped entire sectors became a ghost among footnotes. But ash does not vanish on command. It settles, and sometimes it resurfaces. A young officer aboard a patrol ship once discovered an old combat algorithm buried in a corrupted archive. It was sharp, ruthless, terrifyingly efficient, clearly not designed by any modern strategist. The officer asked who created it. No one answered. Another rumor came from the outer rim of a derelict facility, found with scorch marks identical to Vengean's siege patterns. Investigators dismissed it, but soldiers whispered, "Maybe he's not dead." He was. But the idea mattered more than the truth. Because ideas cannot be erased by documents, they linger in actions, in scars, in the uneasy shift of a commander's eyes when a strategy feels too familiar. Even Baras could not stop those echoes. He could bury the man, but not the impression. Not the fear that had once moved across entire star systems like a cold wind. Not the image of a Sith who obeyed without hunger for thrones. Not the memory of a warrior who broke worlds because he believed it was his duty, not his right. Duty is an uncomfortable legacy. It makes people question the motives of those who still claim power. So, the Empire tightened its grip on the narrative. Officially, Vengean died a traitor. Unofficially, he was not spoken of. Not in classrooms. Not in war rooms. Not even in private. Not because his memory was dangerous, but because it was inconvenient. He was a reminder of what the Empire secretly feared. A Sith who could not be controlled by ambition. A servant who did not seek to lead. A blade that swung only for the sake of the Empire, never for himself. Such a blade is powerful. Such a blade is unpredictable. Such a blade, once broken, leaves ash that clings to everyone who touches it. And so, Vengean's legacy became exactly that. A smear of memory across a history that refused to acknowledge him. Not a monument, not a myth, just ash, scattered through the cracks of an empire that never understood what it had lost. The Force does not write history. It does not keep records, or enforce doctrines, or mark who sits upon a throne. But it remembers, not through names, not through titles, but through presence. And long after Darth Vengean's name faded from the lips of men, his presence remained not in fear, not in glory, but in weight. On worlds where he had stood, the ground still felt quieter. On ships where he had commanded, the corridors echoed with restraint, not violence, but the memory of someone who only struck when there was no other choice. Even the Jedi, those sworn enemies of the Sith, felt it. A night station near the mid-rim once reported a moment of stillness in meditation, a pulse, sharp and cold, followed by a sorrow that did not belong to her. She described it as a shadow grieving itself. The council dismissed it, but those who have walked closest to the Force know what she meant. Some echoes do not come from darkness or light. Some come from the space in between where power was used, not for ambition, but because no one else would bear it. That was where Vengean lived. And that is where he remains. Not in data files, not in Sith prophecy, but in the weight of decisions that leave no joy, no triumph, no reward, only the knowledge that someone had to be the one to carry them. Baras never understood that. He believed legacy was a tool, something to carve, weaponize, display. He believed the Force was a ladder, not a mirror. But the Force does not forget. It does not care for statues or whispers. It listens. And somewhere, deep within its current, the presence that once was Thagis, the boy who obeyed, the man who endured, the warrior who broke himself to serve, still lingers. Not as vengeance, not as hate, but as memory. A stillness, one that presses softly against the minds of those who walk near his ruin, like a hand on the shoulder, unseen but undeniable. And once in a generation, someone hears it. An apprentice who hesitates before striking too hard. A general who looks at the cost before declaring victory. A Sith who wonders just for a moment if there is more to power than domination. They do not know his name, but they feel the question he left behind. They feel the burden. Because in truth, Vengean never wanted glory. He wanted order. He believed the Empire could last if its blades were sharp and silent. He believed service meant sacrifice, and that meant being forgotten. He never feared being hated. He feared being misused. And in the end, that is exactly what happened. But the Force does not mourn with words. It mourns with silence. And in that silence, Vengean endures. A shadow on a path no longer walked. A name erased from stone, but not from consequence. Because even in forgetting, the galaxy bends around those who bore its heaviest truths. And some truths, even when buried, continue to shape the future. Not with thunder, not with fire, but with gravity, the kind only felt in empty rooms. In choices made without recognition. In loyalty, given without return. That is what the Force remembers. Not the lies Baras told. Not the medals never awarded. Not the judgment of a council too busy to care. But the shape of a man who gave everything, for something that would never love him back. He was gone. No grave, no statue, no legacy carved into the stone halls of the Sith Empire. And yet, he remained. Not in form, not in name, but in presence. Across the galaxy, in forgotten battlefields and silent war rooms, something lingered. A tension, a weight, a memory never fully erased. It wasn't fear that had vanished with his body. It wasn't respect that had died long before. It was something more difficult to define, a stillness where noise used to live. Darth Vengean had not been a man of great speeches. He had not gathered followers through charisma or prophecy. He had been a blade, a hammer, a force of nature, wrapped in silence. His legacy was not etched into archives. It was burned into consequence. On Balmorra, an old commander refused to bomb a civilian corridor not out of mercy, but because Vengean wouldn't have wasted fire on fear. No one corrected him. The name slipped out like a habit, like a ghost speaking through a man too old to pretend anymore. On Ziost, during a planetary audit, a junior Sith found a preserved transmission once sealed in a corrupted military server. It wasn't marked. It wasn't encrypted. Just a recording. Vengean's voice, low, quiet, unmistakable. He didn't issue threats. He didn't gloat. He gave orders. Clear, cold, efficient. The file was erased within the hour. But the officer who found it never forgot how it felt to hear him speak. As if the Force itself had gone still, waiting. The Empire had tried to forget him, but the Force did not. Because Vengean had not moved through the galaxy like a fire or a storm. He had moved like a fault line, quiet until it broke. The cracks were still there. Small, hairline fractures in the structure of Sith tradition. Not every apprentice wanted to climb. Some just wanted to serve. And they didn't know why. They didn't know the name that had lived inside the edges of their obedience. They didn't know they were following a shadow. But the Force did. The Jedi never honored him. Why would they? To them, he was a monster, a butcher, a name buried among Sith atrocities. But a few Jedi masters, old, thoughtful, careful ones, acknowledged something in their records. They noted the pattern, the quiet campaigns, the lack of unnecessary cruelty, the absence of political ambition in Vengean's movements. Some Sith, one master wrote, do not hunger, they anchor. That line was redacted later, but it had already been read. There was no movement to restore Vengean's honor, no secret cult, no hidden archive. That was never the point. His legacy was not in how many remembered him, but in what they remembered when they stood alone. Some called it doubt, others called it discipline, but it always sounded the same. It sounded like silence. The silence of a man who had once obeyed without question, who had carried power without asking to be seen, who had vanished because ambition had never been his. It was unnatural, even dangerous, because in the Empire, power is supposed to hunger, power is supposed to speak. But his power had only ever acted, and that made him a threat. Even in death, a threat not to the Republic, not to the Jedi, but to the idea that all Sith must be the same. The Force doesn't forget those who break patterns, even when the galaxy does, even when it wants to, even when it needs to. And so, Darth Vengean, or whatever remained of him, continued to exist where no one could see. A shadow, a weight, a presence in the Force that refused to fade. The Sith teach through pain, through scars, through lessons carved into the body and the mind until the apprentice no longer remembers where the wound ends and the teaching begins. But Vengean's lessons were nothing like that. He never lectured, he never preached, he never claimed wisdom. His teachings were written in silence, a kind of presence that shaped those who followed him, even if they never understood why. It began with discipline. Not the kind shouted by overseers or beaten into acolytes. Vengean's discipline was quieter, controlled, deliberate. His officers remembered how he walked onto a battlefield, slow, steady, as if counting every breath. Each step said what no speech could. Do only what must be done. No more, no less. Many mistook this for cruelty. Some called it apathy. But those who served closest to him saw the truth. Vengean did not enjoy destruction. He endured it, carried it, treated it like a burden he had never chosen but could not put down. That burden became a lesson for the few who paid attention. Even Baras learned from it. He twisted it, corrupted it, turned it into a weapon of manipulation, but the foundation came from Vengean's stillness, his lack of hunger, his refusal to chase the spotlight that every other Sith fought for. Baras saw that silence could be power, and he used it against him. But others learned something different. A captain once recalled how Vengean handled a strategic miscalculation during the Great Galactic War. The officer had made a choice that cost several battalions. He expected punishment, perhaps even death. Instead, Vengean dismissed the room and spoke only to him. "You knew the risk," he said. "You accepted the cost. That is command. No rage, no threats, just truth." It was the only time that Captain ever heard Vengean speak more than a single sentence. Years later, after Vengean's disappearance, the same captain refused to serve under Baras, not out of rebellion, out of understanding. He transferred to a smaller fleet, far from politics, far from ambition. When questioned, he simply said, "My loyalty belonged to a man who carried his own silence." He was never punished. Some lessons cannot be punished. Others were more subtle. A medic who had once tended Vengean's injuries remembered how he refused sedation after a near-fatal strike. Not out of pride, but because he needed the pain to stay awake. When she questioned him, he answered, "Pain is not the threat. Forgetting why you feel it is." She recorded this in her personal notes. She read it to herself when she lost comrades, when she nearly lost herself. For her, Vengean became proof that even a Sith could understand suffering not as a weapon but as a reminder. These lessons did not spread. They did not become doctrine. They were too small, too quiet, too personal. But they stayed with the people who received them, shaping decisions years after the man who gave them had vanished. Not through fear, not through reverence, through gravity. The kind of gravity a dying star leaves behind long after it collapses. But the greatest lesson Vengean left was the one no one wanted to face. Silence is not peace. It is not wisdom. It is not strength. Silence can become a cage, one built from obedience, tightened by loyalty, and sealed by those who fear what might happen if the quiet one ever decides to speak. Vengean never spoke, and that was the lesson. A warning, written not in words but in his fall. If you do not shape your own truth, someone else will shape it for you, and they will use it to bury you. In the Sith Empire, memory is a weapon, and like all weapons, it is forged, sharpened, and wielded by those in power. After Darth Vengean's death, no great ceremony marked his passing. No records were updated, no chronicles written. Instead, silence swept across the Dark Council like a cold tide. His name was spoken once in the form of accusation, then never again. The official report was brief. Darth Vengean, compromised by instability and unsanctioned warfare, was deemed a threat to galactic order and removed accordingly. No details, no context, just the verdict. The Empire had not killed a traitor. It had deleted a problem. One hollow record circulated briefly on cars, an altered transmission showing Vengean issuing orders that contradicted council directives. It was staged, clean, edited by a hand that knew exactly which parts of the truth to remove. The voice was his, but the intent was not. Most citizens didn't notice. Most Sith didn't care. The Empire was still standing. That was enough. Only a few wondered why a warlord as powerful as Vengean had fallen so quietly. Fewer still remembered that power, by itself, meant nothing, especially to a council that measured value by visibility, fear, and leverage. Vengean had none of those left, because Vengean never built a following, never courted support, never maneuvered through political webs. He believed loyalty should be earned in action, not arranged in shadows. And in a system that rewarded ambition above all, he became invisible. Even in life, after his death, the forgetting became easy. His name was removed from dossiers. His campaigns were credited to imperial forces. His teachings, sparse and understated, were replaced by doctrines that praised the ruthless, the loud, the manipulative. Within weeks, his replacement had already begun restructuring his war assets. Within months, his name triggered security clearance warnings. And within a year, newer Sith asked the question with genuine confusion. Who was Darth Vengean? They didn't mean it with malice. They simply didn't know. He was not remembered as a mentor, nor a monster, just a silence in the records where a legacy should have been. It wasn't a purge. It was a disinterest. And that made it worse, because for all the horrors committed by Sith across centuries, most were remembered. Exalted or condemned, they were known. Vengean was not. He became a myth to the few who still whispered, a story passed in half-sentences, told by veterans too afraid to say his name aloud, but too haunted to let it vanish. He never raised his voice. He never turned on his own. He never wanted the seat, just the war. But those whispers had no audience, because the new generation wanted icons, names with power, faces on banners, voices that promised domination and victory and control. Vengean had none of that. And so the Empire forgot him, not because he failed, but because he did not perform. He was replaced by Baras, louder, cleverer, more theatrical, and Baras ensured that every mention of Vengean came with the label unworthy. Because to Baras, legacy was something you could write. To Vengean, it had never mattered at all. But the Force remembered. In cracks between stars, in the weight of old decisions, in the hesitation of commanders who once served him and never quite trusted those who came after. They didn't talk about it, because silence had always followed his name. And maybe that was the only true legacy he left behind. A presence not in holocrons, but in the unease felt when power becomes too loud. And no one dares ask what was lost when the quiet one disappeared. The galaxy did not mourn him. There were no statues, no archives, no chants of his name in Sith temples. And yet, something endured. Not in the records, but in the quiet, in the stillness after battle, in the unspoken doubts of Sith who rose too fast and burned too bright. Vengean became a ghost not of fear, but of warning. His story was not one of weakness. It was the story of a man who followed every order, obeyed every law, and was forgotten the moment he lost his use. The Force does not keep score, but it remembers. It remembers the ones who served with silence, the ones who fell alone, the ones who did not become legends, only shadows. Darth Vengean became a shadow, and in that shadow, the Empire left something it never meant to: regret.